Elizabeth Carter pressed her father's debt letter against her chest and walked straight into Nathaniel Whitmore's mansion without waiting to be announced because her father was dying of shame at home, and somebody in this family had to stop breaking. She didn't come to cry. She didn't come to beg. She came to tell the most powerful man in Virginia the truth, even if it cost her everything. If this story moves you, subscribe and come along for the whole ride and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. Virginia, summer 1816. The letter had been sitting on the kitchen table for 11 days. Elizabeth Carter knew exactly how many days because she had walked past it every single morning and told herself that today would be the day her father picked it up and did something about it. 11 mornings. 11 times she had poured his tea, set it beside his chair, and watched him stare at the wall instead. 11 nights she had lain awake listening to the sound of a proud man crumbling from the inside out. On the 12th morning she picked up the letter herself. She didn't tell him. She didn't ask permission. She folded the paper carefully along its original crease, tucked it into the small leather satchel her mother had left her, put on her second-best dress, the blue one, the one that still had all its buttons, and walked out the front door before her father came downstairs. The Carter house wasn't far from the main road, but it felt far. It had always felt close to everything when they were a family of standing. Now it felt like it sat at the edge of a world that had moved on without them. Elizabeth walked the full 2 miles to the Whitmore estate. She didn't take the wagon. The horse had been sold 3 months ago. She didn't ask their neighbor Mr. Pratt for a ride because Mr. Pratt had already begun looking at their fence line in a way that suggested he was calculating what it might be worth once the Carters defaulted on everything else. She walked. In the summer heat. With the letter pressed flat against her ribs inside the satchel, and her chin up, and her eyes straight ahead. She had her mother's walk. People had told her that her whole life. Eleanor Carter had moved through the world like she owned every inch of ground beneath her feet, even when she didn't. Elizabeth had inherited that walk and very little else. The money was gone. The reputation was threadbare. The house was mortgaged twice over. But the walk, the particular set of the shoulders, the refusal to look down, that had transferred clean. She was going to need it today. The Whitmore estate came into view the way it always did. First, the iron gate, then the long line of oak trees that flanked the drive, then the house itself rising up at the end of it like a statement. It wasn't the biggest estate in Virginia. Nathaniel Whitmore didn't traffic in ostentation. But it was solid in a way that felt almost aggressive. Every stone perfectly fitted, every hinge oiled, every window unbroken. It was the look of a place that had never been allowed to fall into disrepair because its owner did not permit things to fall. Elizabeth had been here once before 8 years ago for a garden party her parents had attended when the Carter name still opened those kinds of doors. She remembered standing near the rose beds with a glass of cold lemonade watching Nathaniel Whitmore move through his own guests like a man tolerating an obligation. He hadn't smiled much. He hadn't lingered. He'd shaken hands and accepted compliments and looked the whole time like he was waiting for everyone to leave. She had been 18 years old, and she'd thought privately that she understood him. That maybe some people were just built for solitude the way other people were built for company. She understood him considerably less now that she was standing at his front gate with her father's debt in her satchel. The gatekeeper was a man named Horace. She learned this when she asked politely because it cost nothing to ask a man his name. Horace was somewhere around 50, weather-worn with the specific look of a man who had been employed at this gate long enough to have developed an entire taxonomy of visitors and exactly how to dispatch each category. He looked at Elizabeth. He looked at her dress. He looked at the absence of a carriage behind her. "You got an appointment, miss?" "No," Elizabeth said. "But I have urgent business with Mr. Whitmore." "Mr. Whitmore don't see people without an appointment." "I understand that. Would you please send word that Miss Elizabeth Carter is here regarding the Carter family account?" Horace's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The Carter name still registered. It registered differently than it used to, but it registered. "You wait here," he said. She waited. 10 minutes. 15. The sun was direct and relentless, and she did not move to the shade because moving to the shade felt like retreating, and she had not walked 2 miles in the summer heat to retreat at the gate. Horace came back. "Mr. Whitmore will see you in the front study. Follow me." The inside of the Whitmore house was cooler than the outside. It smelled like wood polish and old paper and something faintly mineral that Elizabeth eventually identified as the stone of the floors. There were no flowers anywhere. She noticed that. There was art on the walls. Landscapes, a portrait of a man who shared Nathaniel Whitmore's jaw, probably his father, but nothing soft. Nothing that suggested someone lived here for pleasure. She was shown into the front study and left alone. The room was full of ledgers. Not decorative ledgers, working ones open on the desk margins filled with notation in a hand that was precise without being elegant. Maps of land parcels pinned to a board. A set of scales on the corner table. A half-finished cup of coffee going cold beside the inkwell. This was not a room where a man received social calls. This was a room where a man worked. Elizabeth stood in the center of it and did not touch anything. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the hallway, unhurried but deliberate, the footsteps of a man who moved through his own house, like he moved through everything else, as though the floor existed to accommodate him rather than the reverse. Nathaniel Whitmore came through the door and stopped when he saw her. She had expected him to be older somehow, or more formidable in person, or different from her memory of that garden party. He wasn't older. He was 35. She knew that from her father's occasional mentions, and he wasn't exactly formidable, not in the theatrical sense. He was simply concentrated, like he took up the same amount of space as other men, but used it more efficiently. He had his father's jaw, she noted, and his father's dark eyes, and an expression that had probably been described as unreadable for so long, it had simply become his face. He looked at her. Just looked. The way a man looks at something unexpected when he hasn't decided yet how unexpected it is. "Miss Carter," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." She held her ground. "Thank you for seeing me. I understood it was urgent." "It is." He waited. She realized the kind of man who let other people fill silence. She had dealt with that kind before her father's lawyer, the banker, who'd explained to them very patiently how bankrupt they were. She had learned not to fill silence just because it was there. She reached into her satchel and drew out the letter. "My father received this 11 days ago," she said. She crossed the room and laid it on the desk, not handed it to him. Laid it down, because handing it felt like offering a plea and laying it down felt like presenting a fact. "He intended to come himself. He has not been well." Nathaniel Whitmore looked at the letter. He didn't pick it up. "Your father is aware you're here." There was a beat of silence. "No," Elizabeth said. "He is not." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite surprise. More like the registering of a data point that didn't fit his initial calculation. "Sit down, Miss Carter. I'd rather stand if it's all the same to you." "It isn't," he said, and pulled out the chair across from his desk with a gesture that managed to be both impeccably polite and non-negotiable. "Sit down." She sat. He picked up the letter then and read it. She had read it herself 12 times, so she knew exactly how long it took to read. He took longer. Either he was a slow reader, which she doubted, or he was reading it more than once. "Your father borrowed against the Northfield parcel in March of 14, he said without looking up. "Yes." "And again in September of 15. "Yes." "Against the advice of his factor. Against the advice of everyone who knew anything about land investment in this county." Elizabeth kept her voice level. "My father was given information by a man named Gerald Stokes, who represented himself as a land agent with 20 years of experience, and turned out to have approximately 4 years of experience and a great deal of optimism. He convinced my father that the northern tobacco market was about to turn, and that buying into a shipping contract would return double the investment within 18 months. That information was incorrect. Catastrophically incorrect, yes." Nathaniel Whitmore set the letter down and looked at her directly for the first time since he'd read it. "You're not here to dispute the debt. No, the debt is legitimate. My father borrowed the money. He signed the documents in full knowledge of what he was signing, even if he was misled about the underlying venture. I'm not here to argue that the obligation doesn't exist." She paused. I'm here to tell you the truth about our circumstances because my father in his current state would tell you a version of it designed to preserve what's left of his dignity rather than give you the full picture. And I don't think that serves either of you." There was a silence. A real one this time, not a strategic one. "Go on," Nathaniel Whitmore said. She told him everything. The failed investment, the second mortgage, the illness, her father's heart, which had been struggling since winter, which the doctor said was not immediately life-threatening, but which she privately believed had as much to do with shame as with any physical deterioration. The fact that they had sold the carriage, and the better horse, and the silver plate set, and her mother's jewelry. All but one ring, which had been her grandmother's, and which her father had asked her to keep, even when she'd offered to sell it too. She told him about the neighbors who had stopped calling, about the merchants in town who had begun to add a particular pause before completing a transaction with a carter, about the young man in Charlottesville who had been corresponding with her through the spring, and who had, after 2 months of warm letters, gone suddenly and completely silent around the same time word got around about the family's financial position. She didn't tell him that part because she expected sympathy. She told him because it was relevant context, because he needed to understand that what was at stake was not just the parcel of Northfield land or even the house. It was the last remnants of a family that had been decent members of this community for 60 years, and she needed him to make whatever decision he made with the full picture in front of him. Nathaniel Whitmore listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look away. He sat with his hands flat on the desk and listened to her the way a man listens when he has decided that listening is the task, and the task is getting his full attention. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. "You are nothing like your father," he said. It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation delivered like a fact. "No," Elizabeth said. "I've been told that." "How old are you?" 26. "And you walked here." "The horse was sold." Something crossed his face. It wasn't quite a smile. His face didn't seem to be in the habit of smiling, but it was something adjacent to it. A kind of reluctant acknowledgement of a thing he found against his better judgment worth acknowledging. "What is it you're asking me for, Miss Carter, specifically?" She had prepared for this question. She had walked 2 miles preparing for this question, running the words in her head, arranging and rearranging them. "Time," she said. 60 days. "My father has a brother in Philadelphia, my Uncle Thomas, who has agreed in principle to assist us, but he is waiting on the resolution of his own business dealings, which he expects to conclude by the end of August. If you give us 60 days, and my uncle's dealings resolve as expected, we will have the means to repay the full principal, plus whatever interest you determine is appropriate. If they do not resolve, then in 60 days, we will sign over whatever you require without dispute, and make our own arrangements from there. And if I say no, then we sign over whatever you require now, and I thank you for your time and see myself out." He studied her. "You came here expecting I might say no." "I came here prepared for it, yes." "And you came anyway." "The alternative was to not come and let my father lie awake every night for the next 60 days, imagining worse outcomes than the real one." She met his eyes without flinching. "He's done enough of that already." Nathaniel Whitmore stood up from behind his desk. He moved to the window, not the one that faced the drive, but the smaller one on the east wall, the one that faced the far end of the property, though Elizabeth couldn't see what was out there from where she sat. He stood with his back to her for a moment, which she recognized as neither dismissal nor deliberation, but something else. Something more personal. "My father built this estate," he said without turning around. "He borrowed against it twice in the 20s before I was born. Bad harvest years. He paid it back both times." He paused. "He told me debt was not a character flaw. He said it was a calculation, and that what mattered was whether the person making the calculation was honest about it." Elizabeth said nothing. She waited. "Your father was misled by a dishonest man." He turned from the window. "That is different from being a dishonest man himself." "He would not describe it that way," Elizabeth said carefully. "He holds himself responsible." "Does he?" "He holds himself responsible for everything. That's rather his primary difficulty." She paused. It's a common failing in men who were raised to believe that being responsible for things means they can control them. The gap between those two ideas has never been especially comfortable for him. Nathaniel Whitmore looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not approval exactly, but something in that neighborhood. 60 days, he said. Elizabeth went very still. I will hold the note for 60 days. If your uncle's dealings resolve and the funds materialize, you bring them here and we close the account. If they don't, we proceed as you described. He moved back to his desk. I'll have my lawyer draw up an addendum to the existing agreement. It will require your father's signature since he is the named party. I can bring him here, Elizabeth said. He'll come. He should have come himself. Yes, Nathaniel Whitmore said with a flatness that managed not to be unkind. He should have. He sat back down. He pulled one of the open ledgers toward him, and it was clear enough that the meeting was concluding that he was already moving on to the next thing his day required. Elizabeth stood. Mr. Whitmore. He looked up. Why? She asked. You didn't have to do that. I know. Then why? He considered the question. He seemed briefly to consider not answering it. Then he said, Because you walked 2 miles in July heat with your mother's satchel and your father's letter, and you told me the truth when a less honest person would have told me a story. That kind of thing is not common enough to go unrewarded. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, he said. Come back in 60 days. Bring your father. She picked up her satchel. She moved to the door. Miss Carter. She turned. The letter. He held it out to her. She crossed back, took it from his hand. Their fingers didn't touch. It was close, but they didn't. You'll want to have it when you explain the situation to your father, he said. Yes, she said. I will. She walked out of the study through the hallway with the stone floors and the portrait of his father past Horace at the gate and back down the 2 miles of road in the July sun. She was halfway home before she realized her hands were shaking. Not from fear from the release of something she'd been holding too tightly for too long. She stopped walking for a moment. She stood at the side of the road and breathed. Then she set her shoulders and walked the rest of the way home. Today. Her father was at the kitchen table when she came in. He had the look he always had lately. Like a man assembled from parts that no longer quite fit together, the way a piece of furniture looks after it's been moved too many times. I was holding a cup of tea that had long gone cold. He looked at her. He looked at the satchel. He looked at her face. Where have you been? He said. Whitmore Estate, she said. The color drained from his face so completely, she nearly went to him. Elizabeth. He's given us 60 days, she said, while we wait on Uncle Thomas. You'll need to go sign an addendum to the note, but there's no immediate action required. Her father said nothing. His mouth opened, then closed. He was fair, she said. He listened. You had no right. Her father started, and then stopped. And then something in him that had been locked very tight for a very long time seemed to give way all at once. He pressed one hand flat on the table and the other over his eyes, and for a moment he was simply a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had just been told he could set it down for 60 more days. Papa, Elizabeth said quietly. I should have been the one, he said from behind his hand. I should have been the one to go. Yes, she said gently. You should have, and next time you will be. But this time I went, and it's done, and we have 60 days. She sat down across from him. She didn't say that she'd sat in Nathaniel Whitmore's study and felt for the first time in months like someone was listening to her. She didn't say that the walk home had been the loneliest and also the most alive she'd felt since this whole catastrophe had begun. She didn't say that there had been a moment when he was standing at that east window with his back to her, when she had thought that loneliness was something she recognized in him, the way you recognize it in yourself. She said, "Drink your tea, Papa, even if it's cold." Her father put down his hand. His eyes were red at the edges. He picked up his cup. Outside, the summer heat lay flat and relentless on the Carter land, the mortgaged land, the scraped and battered land, the land that still had 60 days to become something other than a loss. Elizabeth sat with her father in the kitchen and didn't look at the window. She already knew what was out there. 3 days later, her father signed the addendum at Whitmore Estate. Elizabeth did not go with him. She had suggested it had offered to accompany him to sit in the hallway, at least in case he needed support. Her father had refused with a firmness that told her he understood exactly what it would mean if he couldn't do this one thing on his own. He came home 2 hours later. "I was very correct," her father said, which was the highest praise William Carter extended to anyone he didn't know well. "Very correct and businesslike, not unkind." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "He isn't unkind. He asked after you." Elizabeth looked up from the bread she was slicing. "He asked if you had arrived home safely," her father said with a careful neutrality that told Elizabeth he had noticed this and was choosing not to comment on it beyond the bare fact. "I told him yes." "That was kind of him," Elizabeth said. "Yes." Her father looked at her for a moment. "It was." She went back to slicing the bread. 60 days was not a long time. Elizabeth learned this in a way she had not expected, not because the days passed quickly, but because every day had in it the particular texture of time that is measured. The awareness that the number is counting down. That 60 becomes 53 becomes 41. She wrote to Uncle Thomas. He wrote back cheerful letters, confident in tone, full of phrases like "very nearly there" and "should be resolved any day now." She read the letters carefully and tried to determine what percentage of their optimism was genuine and what percentage was the natural protective instinct of a man who did not want to be the one who let his brother's family down. She gardened. It was the only thing she had been able to do throughout this entire disaster that gave her the sensation of cause and effect. Working correctly, put a seed in the groundwater, watch it emerge. The Carter land had a kitchen garden that had once been her mother's great pride and was now, through Elizabeth's efforts, producing with a diligence that seemed almost aggressive. She grew tomatoes and cucumbers and climbing beans and 4 varieties of herb that she sold in small packets at the market on Saturdays, which brought in enough to keep the household account from bottoming out entirely. She did not think about Nathaniel Whitmore. Or rather, she thought about him the way you think about a problem you've set aside temporarily. Deliberately. Aware that the thinking is happening even as you do the thing you're doing, instead of thinking about him. She thought about the east window. About whatever was out there that he'd looked at when he was deciding. She thought about the way he'd held out the letter. The particular care of the gesture. She told herself these were simply the observations of a person who paid attention to people, which she always had. She told herself there was nothing particular about them. She was not entirely convincing. Day 47. A letter arrived from Uncle Thomas. Elizabeth opened it in the kitchen before her father came downstairs, which she told herself was simply efficiency, and not the specific kind of efficiency that is actually fear. She read it. She folded it back along its crease. She set it in the center of the kitchen table. She went to the window. The business dealings had not resolved. There had been a complication, a change in the terms of the contract, a legal challenge that Thomas had not anticipated. He was very sorry. He was terribly sorry. He expected a resolution within another 3 months, perhaps 4. He remained confident. He hoped they understood. 3 months, perhaps 4. They did not have 3 months. They had 13 days. Elizabeth stood at the kitchen window for a long time. Long enough that the light changed. Long enough that she heard her father's footsteps on the stairs and turned to face the door before he came through it. He saw the letter on the table. He knew from the way it was folded and from her face. "Thomas," he said. "Yes." Her father sat down. He didn't reach for the letter. "How bad?" 3 more months, he says. Perhaps 4. Her father was quiet for a long moment. His hands were flat on the table again. She noticed he did that, used his hands to anchor himself, pressed them flat, like he was steadying a surface that kept threatening to tip. "Then we go to Whitmore," he said. "We tell him the truth. We give him what he's owed." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "We do. I'll go tomorrow." "Papa." He looked at her. "This time, I'll go with you." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was complicated enough she couldn't read all of it. Then he nodded. "Yes," he said. "This time you come with me." They arrived at the Whitmore estate at 10 in the morning. William Carter and his daughter in the borrowed wagon of a neighbor, who it turned out had not been calculating the fence line for himself, but had simply been a man uncertain how to offer help and doing it badly. Nathaniel Whitmore received them in the same front study. Elizabeth watched her father and Nathaniel Whitmore in the same room together and understood with a clarity she hadn't had access to before the particular weight of a proud man acknowledging a debt to another man. It was not comfortable to witness. It was not meant to be comfortable. Her father spoke first, directly. He explained about Thomas, about the delay, about the 13 days that remained on the addendum and would not be enough. Nathaniel Whitmore listened. He looked at William Carter the way he had looked at Elizabeth fully, without letting his attention drift. Then he said, "Mr. Carter, has your daughter told you that she informed me at our first meeting that you would likely offer me a version of your circumstances designed to preserve your dignity?" William Carter blinked. He looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth said nothing. She was, Nathaniel Whitmore said, entirely correct about that. There was the barest suggestion of something in his voice, not amusement exactly, but its near relation. She was also correct that a full account served both of us better than a partial one. So I will ask you now to give me the full account. Not the version that makes the best case for your family, the actual account. There was a pause. Then William Carter, who had spent 40 years carefully managing what the world knew and did not know about the interior workings of his family, gave Nathaniel Whitmore the actual account. Elizabeth sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to her father be honest, and found that it was one of the hardest and also most relieving things she had ever been present for. When he was done, Nathaniel Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked at Elizabeth. "Miss Carter," he said. She met his eyes. "Would you mind waiting in the hall for a few minutes? I need to speak with your father privately." She minded. But she nodded and stood and went into the hallway, and she sat on the narrow wooden bench outside the study door with her hands still folded in her lap. From behind the closed door, she could hear the low register of two men talking. Not the words, just the shape of the conversation, the way it moved, the pauses, the occasional shift in tone. It went on for 20 minutes. Then the door opened. Her father came out first. He looked different. She couldn't have explained exactly how. Some internal knot she hadn't known he was carrying had shifted, maybe not untied completely, but moved enough that he held himself differently. "Elizabeth," he said. "Papa, Mr. Whitmore wants to speak with you." She looked at her father's face. He nodded once with an expression that said, "Go on, it's all right." She went back into the study. Nathaniel Whitmore was standing at the east window again. "Sit down, Miss Carter." She sat. He turned from the window. "Your uncle's situation is what it is. 3 months, perhaps 4. That's outside the scope of the addendum." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "We understand that." "What you don't know," he said, "is that I've been aware for the past 3 weeks that the timeline was likely to be a problem." Elizabeth looked at him. "I had dealings of my own with a man who knows your Uncle Thomas. The legal challenge to his contract is not a new development. It emerged in early July." He said this without accusation, simply as fact. "Your uncle chose not to communicate the full picture until it became unavoidable." "He was trying to protect us," Elizabeth said. "Very likely. It's a common choice." Nathaniel Whitmore came back to the desk and sat down. "It's also the same choice your father would have made if he'd come here instead of you." Elizabeth said nothing. "I am going to make you an offer," he said. "Not your father, you. Because you are of the 2 Carters I have dealt with this summer, the one who operates from full information, and what I'm about to propose requires someone who does." He folded his hands on the desk. "My father's will specifies that I must be married before my 36th birthday in order to retain sole ownership of this estate. That birthday is in November of this year." Elizabeth was very still. "I am aware of how this sounds," Nathaniel Whitmore said. "I am aware that what I am about to propose is not conventional and is not the offer a woman of your intelligence and self-possession should have to receive. I am telling you that because I think you're owed that acknowledgement before I make it." He looked at her steadily. "I am asking you to consider marrying me." The room was very quiet. "In exchange," he continued, "I will clear your family's account entirely. Your father keeps the house and the land. Your uncle's situation becomes irrelevant." He paused. "I also want to be clear that I am not asking you to perform the role of wife as the society of this county would define it. I am asking you to be present, to be honest, which you already appear to be constitutionally incapable of being otherwise, and to apply whatever intelligence you've been applying to your kitchen garden and your family's accounts to the management of this estate." Elizabeth found her voice. "You don't know me," she said. "You've spoken with me twice. I know that you walked 2 miles in July to tell me the truth. I know that you sat in this room and gave me an accurate account of your family's circumstances when every social instinct would have told you to soften it. I know that your father came in here this morning a different man than he would have been if you hadn't gotten to him first." He held her gaze. "I've run this estate alone for 9 years. I know what honest people look like. I don't encounter them often enough." Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. She thought about her father's hands flat on the kitchen table. She thought about Uncle Thomas's optimistic letters. She thought about the young man in Charlottesville who had gone silent when the Carter name stopped being useful. She thought about the east window and whatever was out there that Nathaniel Whitmore looked at when he needed to think. "I have a condition," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Go on," he said. "I won't marry a man I haven't spoken to honestly about who I am." She kept her voice level. "Not my family's circumstances. Me. I want 1 week. I want to come here, or you come to us. I have no attachment to the logistics, and I want us to talk the way 2 people should talk before they make a decision like this. And at the end of that week, if either of us determines that this is a mistake, we say so, and we find another solution to the account, and no one owes anyone anything." Nathaniel Whitmore studied her. "1 week," he said. 1 week. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable condition," he said. "I thought so. I'll come to you, tomorrow, 4 o'clock. He glanced at the open ledgers on his desk, a gesture that was not dismissive, but simply the honest reflex of a man who was always aware of his schedule. "I have work here in the mornings." 4 o'clock, Elizabeth said. "I'll make sure we have something to offer you at least. We still have a functional kitchen." "I don't require—" "I know you don't require it," she said. "I'm offering it anyway." He looked at her. Then for the first time since she had met him, something in Nathaniel Whitmore's face moved in a direction that was not purely businesslike. Not much, just enough to see. "All right," he said. 4 o'clock. She came out of the study to find her father still on the narrow bench, his hat in his hands, turning it by the brim, the way he did when he was working something through. He looked up. "Well," he said. "He wants a week," Elizabeth said, because that was technically true, and was the part her father needed to hear first. "A week," her father repeated. "A week to what?" Elizabeth looked at her father, at the lines in his face that hadn't been there 3 years ago, at the good coat he'd worn today, because he still understood what occasions required, at the hands that were gripping his hat, with the particular grip of a man who had been given against all expectation slightly more time. "To see if this can work," she said. Her father searched her face. He was not, despite everything, a slow man. He had simply been a man moving through grief and shame at a pace that looked like slowness from the outside. "Elizabeth," he said carefully. "One thing at a time, Papa," she said. "Let's get home." She helped him up. They walked out through the hallway with the stone floors, past the portrait of the man with Nathaniel Whitmore's jaw, through the front door, and into the summer afternoon. The drive looked the same as it always had, oak trees, Iron Gate Horace with his taxonomy of visitors. But something was different. Elizabeth couldn't have said exactly what. Just that the estate felt less like a wall she had walked into, and more like a place she was beginning, however tentatively, to understand. She kept her chin up and her eyes forward, and walked her mother's walk all the way to the borrowed wagon, and she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Nathaniel Whitmore arrived at 4 o'clock exactly. Not 4:05. Not 3:55. 4 o'clock, the way a man arrives when he has decided that punctuality is a form of respect rather than a social nicety. Elizabeth heard the horse on the drive and was already at the door before her father could get up from his chair, which was deliberate on her part. She wanted to be the one who opened it. I had come alone. No groom, no attendant. Just the man and the horse, and the particular self-sufficiency of someone who had learned at some point in his life that bringing people along created complications. He took off his hat when she opened the door. "Miss Carter." "Mr. Whitmore, come in." She stood back. He stepped inside and looked at the Carter house with the same quality of attention he brought to everything. Not evaluative in the way Caroline Bellamy would have been evaluative, calculating what it signaled about its inhabitants, but simply observant. Taking in what was there. What was there was modest, clean. The furniture was good, but old. The kind of good that meant it had been bought when buying the best was a reasonable choice and had been maintained through years when it was no longer. There were books. More books than furniture nearly. And flowers on the table, not purchased flowers, but flowers from the garden cut that morning, arranged in a pitcher because they had long since sold the good vases. Her father was in the sitting room. He stood when Nathaniel came in, and there was a moment between the two men, brief, not quite comfortable but honest, where they simply acknowledged each other as men who had already said the necessary things and did not need to repeat them. "Mr. Whitmore," her father said. "Mr. Carter, how is your health?" "Improving." Her father said it with a slight lift of the chin that told Elizabeth it was true, and that he was somewhat surprised to find it true. "Thank you for asking." Nathaniel nodded. He sat in the chair Elizabeth indicated. She sat across from him. Her father, with the tactfulness she had not known he possessed until this strange summer had called it out of him, picked up his book and became very absorbed in it. "I thought," Elizabeth said, "that since you already know the worst about my family's financial position, we might spend today on something else." "Such as?" "Such as whatever you'd like to know, that you actually need to know, before November." He considered this. "What would you like to know about me?" "I know your name and your estate and your birthday," Elizabeth said. "I know you run a significant agricultural operation and that you lost your wife." She paused. "I'm sorry, I should have asked before assuming that was common knowledge." "It is common knowledge," he said without visible distress. "Margaret died in the winter of 12, a fever." "I'm sorry." "Yes." He said it simply without elaborating, and she understood that this was not coldness, but the particular way a person holds grief that has been held long enough to become part of their structure. "We were married 2 years. Were you—" She stopped. "Go on." "Were you happy?" It was, she knew, a remarkable question to ask a man she had met 3 times. His expression told her he found it remarkable too. But he didn't deflect it. "We were," he said slowly, "working toward it. I think we would have been given more time." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "I was not at 26 a man who was easy to be married to. I imagine I have not improved substantially in that regard." "What made you difficult?" "I worked too much. I expected too much. I had a precise idea of how things should be done, and not enough patience for how they actually got done." He said this without apparent shame, which she found more reassuring than if he'd been contrite about it. Contrite meant he knew it was wrong. Straightforward meant he had actually looked at it. "Margaret used to say I ran the estate the way other men run a military campaign." "And what did you say to that?" "I said a military campaign requires coordination and clear objectives," and she agreed that was more or less her point. Elizabeth, despite everything, nearly smiled. "She sounds like she was sharp." "She was," he said, "considerably sharper than I gave her credit for at the time." There was a beat of quiet. Not uncomfortable, the specific kind of quiet that falls when something true has just been said, and both people in the room know it. "I don't have a precise idea of how things should be done," Elizabeth said. "I have a precise idea of what outcome I want, and a great deal of flexibility about the path." He looked at her. "That is almost the opposite of me." "Yes," she said. "I noticed." He came back the next day at 4 o'clock. This time she took him to the garden. Not to impress him, she was past the calculation of impressiveness, or she was trying to be, but because the garden was where she thought most clearly, and she had realized after the first conversation that she needed to be somewhere, she thought clearly in order to talk to this man the way she actually needed to talk to him. She showed him the tomatoes first. This was not a romantic gesture. This was a practical one because the tomatoes were the most successful thing she had grown, and success she had found was clarifying. "These varieties," she said, kneeling beside a heavy vine. "My mother planted the seeds originally. I've saved and replanted for 3 seasons now. They've gotten more productive each year, not less." Nathaniel crouched beside her. He was wearing the same coat he'd worn yesterday, well-made, understated, the coat of a man who didn't think much about his coat because he didn't need to. "What changed?" he asked. "The soil. I started amending it in the fall with organic matter rather than waiting for spring. Changed the drainage on the east side of the bed, moved the staking method." She ran her thumb along the underside of a leaf, checking. "Small adjustments. Consistent ones. You know a great deal about agricultural management." "I know a great deal about this garden," she said. "I know slightly less about larger-scale cultivation, but I've read enough to understand the principles. They're not so different." She stood up and brushed her hands against her apron. "Why do you still have the tobacco fields in the northern parcel? The soil profile there isn't suited to it." He stood up beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "That parcel has always grown tobacco," he said. "I know. And before that it was likely forest, and now it's tobacco, and in 10 years it'll be exhausted ground if you don't rotate it." She looked at him directly. "I saw your maps on the wall in the study. The northern parcel gets an entirely different runoff pattern from the eastern fields. It's wetter, cooler. You could grow hemp there, it actually does better in that soil type. Higher return per acre right now too, given the market." He looked at her for a long moment. "You analyzed my land parcel maps during the 30 minutes you spent in my study waiting for a meeting." "I had nothing else to do." "Most women would have looked at the artwork." "I looked at the artwork too," she said. "The landscape by the window is better than the portrait. Whoever painted your father had a strong grasp of resemblance and a limited grasp of character. He looks merely stern in the portrait. I suspect he was something more complicated than that." Nathaniel Whitmore said absolutely nothing for 5 full seconds. Then he said, "He was." On the 3rd day, he brought documents. Not the debt addendum, different documents. Land surveys and yield records, and a ledger from the previous 3 growing seasons. He spread them on the Carter kitchen table, while her father watched from his chair with an expression Elizabeth couldn't entirely decipher. "I want your assessment," Nathaniel said to Elizabeth. She sat across from him and looked through the records and said what she saw, which was that his eastern fields were performing below their potential due to a planting interval issue, that his labor allocation for harvest season was slightly top-heavy on skilled labor and light on general labor, which was causing bottlenecks, and that his projections for winter grain were optimistic if the summer's rainfall pattern continued. He listened to all of this. "You're correct about the eastern fields," he said. "I've known about the planting interval for 2 seasons and haven't addressed it." "Why not?" "Because addressing it means disrupting the routine my foreman has managed for 12 years, and my foreman is not a man who handles disruption well." He paused. "He's also one of the finest foremen in this county, and I have no interest in losing him over a planting interval." "Then frame the adjustment as an experiment rather than a correction," Elizabeth said immediately. "Tell him you've read something new about the interval method. You don't have to say where you read it, and you want to try it on a test section this season. If it performs better, the evidence makes the argument for you, and he adopts it because it works, not because he was wrong." Her father looked up from his book. Nathaniel looked at her steadily. "You've managed difficult people before," he said. "I've managed people," she said. "Everyone's difficult if you come at them the wrong way." Her father made a sound that was either agreement or the clearing of a throat. It was impossible to say. On the 4th day, it rained, and Nathaniel didn't come. Elizabeth told herself this was entirely reasonable. A man running an estate the size of Whitmore's had obligations that superseded social calls in poor weather. She told herself this with great clarity and conviction, and spent approximately 3 hours being very sure she was not watching the window. At 5:30, there was a knock at the door. She made herself walk to it at a normal pace. How was wet? Not dramatically wet. He had clearly ridden fast once the weather worsened, but his coat was dark at the shoulders, and his hat was dripping, and he was standing on her doorstep, looking like a man who had made a decision and acted on it before he'd had time to talk himself out of it. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was held up at the mill." "It's fine," she said. "Come in." "I can't stay long. He stopped. He looked at her. He seemed briefly uncertain in a way she had not seen him be uncertain before. "I wanted to keep our appointment." Elizabeth studied him for a moment. "Come in," she said again, quieter this time. He sat at the kitchen table. She gave him a towel for his hat and put water on for coffee, and did not make any remark about the fact that he had ridden 30 minutes in the rain to keep an appointment. He hadn't been obligated to keep because she didn't think either of them would benefit from her saying it out loud. They talked for an hour. About his mother who had died when he was 11. About the way the estate had felt different after that. Not terrible because his father had been a capable if remote presence, but quieter, in a way that had very little to do with noise. About how he had learned to run it by following his father through every transaction and decision for 10 years, saying almost nothing, just watching. About how his father had died when he was 24, and he had taken the reins and discovered that watching someone do a thing and doing the thing were considerably different. "I made a great many mistakes in the first 3 years, he said. "I would not have admitted that to anyone at the time. What changed? I made enough of them to understand they weren't going to stop unless I changed something." He turned his coffee cup on the table, a small, deliberate motion. "Pride is only useful up to the point where it prevents you from learning. After that, it's just expensive." Elizabeth thought about her father. About 11 days of letters on a kitchen table. "My father is a good man," she said. "I know. I want you to know that I know his decisions created this situation. But the decisions came from love mostly. He wanted to give us more than we had. He trusted someone he shouldn't have trusted because he wanted to believe the thing they were telling him." She looked at her hands. "I've been angry at him. I want to tell you that honestly, because I think you should know who you're dealing with, someone who has been angry at her father and who has also mostly forgiven him. Those things can be true at the same time." Nathaniel was quiet. "My father made a decision when I was 19, he said after a moment, that I disagreed with fundamentally. About a land sale. He sold 60 acres to a neighbor I knew was going to mismanage them. I told him so. He sold them anyway." He paused. He was right about the transaction, and wrong about the man, and the 60 acres were eventually foreclosed and sold to someone who did manage them properly. So the outcome he wanted came about by a different route than he intended. "Did you tell him he was wrong?" "After the fact, yes." "What did he say?" "He said that being right about the destination didn't make my prediction about the route worth the relationship I'd damaged by insisting on it." He looked at her. "I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it." Elizabeth said, "He sounds like he was something more complicated than stern." Something moved in Nathaniel Whitmore's face that she was beginning to recognize as the closest he came to warmth when he wasn't guarding against it. "He was," he said. Day 5. Caroline Bellamy arrived at the Carter house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which was not during the hours Nathaniel visited, and was therefore Elizabeth understood immediately deliberate. She arrived in a carriage. Good one. The Bellamy family ran to good carriages the way the Carter family had once run to good books. She came to the door herself, which surprised Elizabeth slightly, because Caroline Bellamy was not generally known for doing things herself when she could send someone else. She was 30 years old and very beautiful in the specific way of a woman who had been told so consistently since childhood that she had incorporated it into her understanding of how the world worked. She wore blue. Of course she wore blue. "Miss Carter," she said when Elizabeth opened the door. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Elizabeth said. "Come in." This was, she knew, a mistake in terms of pure strategy. Inviting Caroline Bellamy into your house gave her information about your house. But turning her away gave her the satisfaction of having made you afraid, and Elizabeth was not about to provide that. They sat in the sitting room. Her father was mercifully in the back garden, which meant she didn't have to watch him manage this with her at the same time. "I'll be direct," Caroline said. "Please," Elizabeth said. "I have been aware for some time that Nathaniel Whitmore is in need of a wife before his birthday in November." She folded her hands in her lap in the manner of a woman who had been trained since girlhood to keep her hands still. "I have also been aware that your family's financial situation has created a certain opening that he may be considering." "Has he told you something is being considered?" "Nathaniel doesn't tell me things," Caroline said without visible bitterness, which was more frightening than bitterness would have been. "He doesn't tell anyone things, but I know him well enough to infer them." "I'm sure you do," Elizabeth said pleasantly. Caroline looked at her. The look was sharp and not entirely without respect, which Elizabeth found oddly more dangerous than contempt. "I want you to understand something," Caroline said. "I am not here to threaten you. I am here to give you information that I believe you deserve to have before you make a significant decision." "All right," Elizabeth said. "Give me the information." "Nathaniel Whitmore is not a man who can be changed by love. He is not cold because he hasn't met the right person. He is cold because coldness is the condition of his nature, and 35 years have settled it as permanent." Caroline paused. "I have known him for 20 years. I am not telling you this to discourage you from an advantageous match. I am telling you this so that if you walk into that estate as its mistress, you do so knowing what you're walking into." Silence. Elizabeth looked at Caroline Bellamy for a long moment. Long enough to see past the surface of the speech to what was underneath it, which was not calculated cruelty. It was something more complicated and considerably sadder. "You love him," Elizabeth said. Caroline's composure didn't crack, but something behind it shifted. "I have known him for 20 years, she said again, which was not quite an answer and was also completely an answer. "I see," Elizabeth said quietly. "I am not asking you to step aside," Caroline said with a precision that told Elizabeth she had prepared this sentence very carefully. "I would not ask that. I am asking you to understand what you're committing to." "May I tell you something honestly?" Elizabeth said. "Please. I don't know yet whether I'm committing to anything. I have until tomorrow to decide." She kept her voice level and her hands still. "But I'll tell you what I have observed in 5 days of conversation with Nathaniel Whitmore, because I think you deserve that in return for what you've told me." Caroline waited. "He is not cold," Elizabeth said. "He is defended. Those are different things. Cold means there's nothing underneath. Defended means there is, and it cost him enough times that he stopped letting it show." She paused. "His mother died when he was 11. His wife died when he was 28. He has run a 500-acre estate alone since he was 24. He has had approximately no experience of being known by someone who had no interest in what he owned." She looked at Caroline directly. "I'm not saying he'll transform. I'm saying I don't think transformation is what's needed. I think what's needed is someone who knows how to be patient with a thing that's alive but slow." Caroline was very still. "Like a garden," she said softly. Elizabeth looked at her. "Yes, like a garden." There was a silence between them that was, if not warm, something other than hostile. Something in the vicinity of two women looking at each other honestly across a situation that had not been designed with either of their interests in mind. "You're more than I expected," Caroline said finally. "I imagine I am," Elizabeth said. "You expected someone desperate." "Yes, I am," Elizabeth said. "But desperation comes in different qualities." She stood up. "Thank you for coming, Miss Bellamy. I mean that without any irony." Caroline stood. At the door she paused. "If it works," she said, not turning around. "If it actually works, don't waste it." Then she was through the door and into the carriage and gone. Elizabeth stood in the sitting room for a long time after the carriage sound faded. Then she went out to the garden and found her father trimming the beanstalks with a concentration that told her he had heard the carriage arrive and had stayed out here specifically to not know who it was. "Caroline Bellamy came to call," Elizabeth said. Her father's trimming slowed. "To warn you off," he said. It wasn't a question. To give me information, Elizabeth said. In her telling, her father looked at her sideways. And she loves him, Elizabeth said. Has for 20 years, probably. And he has never apparently looked at her the way he looked at my tomato plants. Her father blinked. Your tomato plants, he said. He crouched in the dirt and looked at my tomatoes for 10 minutes, Papa. He asked questions about the soil amendments. He wanted to understand why they were doing well. She looked at the beansteaks. Caroline Bellamy, in 20 years, has apparently given him exactly what he expected the world to give him, which means he's never had to look at her. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, Elizabeth, I want to be sure you know that whatever you decide tomorrow, whatever it is, I will not hold you to it. Not for the debt, not for the house. Whatever we lose. Papa, no, listen to me. He turned to face her fully, and she saw very much her father in that moment. Not the diminished version of the past year, but the actual man, the one who had read to her from the history books and taught her to do accounts and told her when she was 12 years old that being a woman was not a limitation unless she accepted someone else's definition of it. Whatever we lose together. I would rather lose the house 1,000 times than have you walk into a life you didn't choose. Elizabeth looked at her father. I know, she said. Then what are you going to tell him? She picked up a beansteak that had fallen and pushed it back into the earth. I'm going to tell him the truth, she said. The 6th day, 4 o'clock. He came to the door and she said, Come to the garden. And he came without asking why, which she noticed, because a man who didn't ask why, when asked to the garden, was a man who had over the course of 5 days developed a certain quality of trust. They stood at the far end by the section she hadn't shown him yet. The section her mother had planted and that Elizabeth had largely left alone, not neglected, but not developed. Preserved more accurately. Kept as it was. My mother planted this section, she said. These are her herbs. Lavender, chamomile, the old medicinal varieties she got from her own mother. She paused. I didn't change anything here. Everything else I've improved or adjusted. This I kept the same. Nathaniel looked at it. Why, he said. Because some things don't need improving, she said. They need honoring. He was quiet. Caroline Bellamy came yesterday, Elizabeth said. He went very still. I know, he said. You knew she was coming. I knew she was likely to. He turned to look at her. What did she say? That you're incapable of being changed by love, Elizabeth said. That your coldness is constitutional. That she was telling me this so I'd understand what I was walking into. And what did you tell her? That you're not cold. Elizabeth met his eyes. That you're defended, and that there's a difference. Something happened in his face. Slow the way things happened in his face, not like a flash, but like a change in light. The kind that's already happened before, you're sure you saw it begin. I owe you the full truth, he said. Before tomorrow. Then tell it. He looked at the herb section her mother had planted. He didn't look at her when he started talking, which she understood. Some truths are easier when you're not watching someone receive them. When Margaret died, he said, I told myself the estate was enough, that I had built something real and lasting, and that was sufficient purpose for a man. I believed it. Mostly. He paused. Last year my foreman's daughter was married on the back lawn. I was invited. I stood at the edge of it, and I watched that family, and I thought for the first time in a very long time that I had made an error somewhere. Not a mistake about land or management or investment, an error about something less correctable than that. Elizabeth waited. And then you walked into my study in July, he said, with your mother's satchel and your father's letter, and you looked at me like I was a person. He turned to face her. Not a resource or a connection or an obligation. A person. And I didn't know what to do with that. So you made me a business proposal, Elizabeth said. Yes. Because that you knew how to do. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who crouched in garden dirt and listened to her talk about tomato varieties and soil amendments. At the man who had ridden in the rain to keep an appointment he wasn't obligated to keep. At the man who had stood at his east window and looked at whatever was out there when he needed to think, and then turned around and offered her an honest deal. "I'll marry you," she said. He didn't say anything immediately. "Not because of the debt," she said. "I want that on record. The debt is real and the terms are real, but that's not why." She held his gaze. "I'll marry you because in 5 days of conversation, I have not once felt like you were managing me. And because you listened to everything I said about the planting interval and the northern parcel, and you didn't dismiss any of it because it came from a woman. And because when you don't know something, you say so." She paused. "Those things are rarer than money, Mr. Whitmore. Considerably rarer." His jaw moved slightly, the barest tightening. "Nathaniel," he said, "I beg your pardon. If you're going to marry me," he said, "you might as well call me Nathaniel." Elizabeth looked at him. Something that was absolutely not a smile moved across her own face in return. "Nathaniel," she said, and then they were standing in her mother's garden in the long gold light of a Virginia summer afternoon. Two people who had just agreed to something enormous, and neither of them said anything else for a moment. They didn't need to. The quiet between them was not empty. It was full of everything that had been said in 5 days, and everything that had not been said yet, and the particular aliveness of a decision made by two people who had both looked at it from every angle first. Her father appeared in the doorway of the house. He looked at them. He looked at Elizabeth's face. He looked at Nathaniel's. Then he went back inside without a word, moving with something that if she hadn't known better, she might have described as a lightness he hadn't carried in a very long time. The announcement was made the following week. It was not made at a social gathering or by a letter to the county families. It was made the way Nathaniel Whitmore apparently made most things, directly without ceremony, through the appropriate channels with the necessary witnesses. The papers were drawn. The debt was cleared. The addendum was replaced by a settlement agreement that was her father's new lawyer told him privately extraordinarily favorable. Elizabeth moved to the Whitmore estate on a Tuesday. She brought very little: her clothes, her books, her mother's satchel, and 3 cuttings from the Carter garden wrapped in wet cloth. She didn't try to bring everything. She had no illusions about what a beginning looked like. A beginning looked like 3 cuttings and wet cloth, not a full transplant. The housekeeper. Mrs. Aldridge received her with the careful correctness of a woman who had served this household long enough to reserve judgment until judgment was warranted. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. Elizabeth had known intellectually that this was what she would now be called. The sound of it was still a small shock, like cold water from a tap you expected to be warm. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, "I'd like to learn how this house runs before I suggest any changes to it. Would you be willing to spend some time this week walking me through your routines?" Mrs. Aldridge looked at her with an expression that shifted almost invisibly from carefully neutral to something fractionally warmer. "I would," she said. Nathaniel was in the study when Elizabeth came to find him that evening. He looked up from the ledger he was working through. He looked, she thought, exactly like himself. Not nervous, not altered, not performing the version of himself a new marriage might be expected to produce. Just himself. "How was the first day?" he said. "Instructive," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge knows more about this property than your maps do." "That is entirely accurate," he said. "I'd like to walk the north parcel tomorrow." "I'll go with you." She sat down across from him in the chair she had sat in for every conversation this week, the chair that was starting to feel like it had her particular shape in it. "Nathaniel." He looked up. "What's outside the east window?" she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, and she followed him to the window, and he pushed it open, and she looked out at what he looked at when he needed to think. It was the garden. His mother's garden. Long untended. Overgrown and quiet, and unmistakably alive underneath it all. She stood at the window and looked at it for a long time. "It's not dead," she said. "No," he said. He was standing just behind her. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she was aware of him as a specific warmth in the room. "I know that." "It's been waiting," she said. "Yes." She turned from the window. I was looking at her with the expression she was beginning to know, the one that came when something landed in him that he hadn't been prepared for and hadn't yet decided what to do with. She didn't press it. She had learned in 5 days that some things needed time the way gardens needed time. That patience was not passivity. That a thing growing was different from a thing staying still, even when you couldn't see it yet. "Get some sleep," she said. "We've got a parcel to walk in the morning." And she went to her room in the house that was now her house, and she lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of an unfamiliar place settling around her, which she thought was probably what every beginning sounded like from the inside. She was not afraid. She was against all the odds of the last 6 months, something that felt cautiously close to ready. The north parcel was worse than the map suggested. Elizabeth stood at the edge of it, the morning after she moved in. Nathaniel 2 steps to her left, and she didn't say anything for a long moment, because she was looking at it the way she looked at everything, all the way through, past the surface down to what was actually happening underneath. What was actually happening was that 20 years of tobacco had taken something from this ground that the ground hadn't finished grieving yet. "How long since it last yielded a full crop?" she asked. 3 seasons, Nathaniel said. "Yield dropped 40% in 12, another 20 in 14. We've been planting cover crops since 16, but it hasn't recovered the way I expected." "Cover crop alone won't do it," she said. "Not this quickly. The nitrogen's depleted, but that's not the whole problem. The top 6 inches have compacted. Look at the way the water's pooling at the edge there. Your drainage is failing before it starts." She walked forward several paces, crouched, pressed 2 fingers into the soil, and brought them up. "You need to break this up before you plant anything. Deep tilling, then a combination of legumes and—" She stopped. "Sorry, you didn't ask for my assessment." "I brought you out here," he said. "I asked." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that quality of attention that she was starting to understand was simply how he looked when he was actually interested in something, as opposed to merely tolerating it. "Deep tilling," she said. "Then a mix of clover and vetch for the first season. Let it sit. Don't plant a cash crop on it for at least 1 full growing season, no matter how much the numbers tempt you. That's expensive patience." "Yes," she said. "Most things worth doing are." She stood up, brushed her hands clean. He was still looking at her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, which meant something. She was learning to read the difference. They walked the full perimeter of the north parcel and then the east fields, and by the time they came back to the house, she had a working list in her head of 6 things that needed addressing in order of urgency, and she was already composing how to present them to his foreman, whose name was Davis, and who had the previous evening looked at Elizabeth over the dinner table with the specific expression of a man who had worked for someone for 12 years and was not yet sure what to make of someone new walking into the middle of that arrangement. She was going to need to earn Davis. She knew that. She also knew that trying to earn him directly would backfire. A man like Davis didn't respond to being managed. He responded to being proven right. So she would need to be right about enough things in front of him without making a point of being right, and let him arrive at his own conclusions. It was, she thought, not entirely different from the tomato steaks. 3 days into the marriage, Nathaniel's cousin arrived. His name was Franklin Whitmore, and he came from Richmond with a leather bag and a smile that Elizabeth recognized from 40 feet away as the particular smile of a man who had already decided something before he arrived and was using the smile to cover the time between deciding and announcing. I was 40, broad-shouldered, with Nathaniel's jaw in a softer version, and he greeted Elizabeth with an elaborate courtesy that was slightly too elaborate, the kind of warmth that was actually calculation wearing warmth's clothes. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, taking her hand. "What a genuine surprise, and such a fortunate one for Nathaniel, I must say." "Mr. Whitmore," Elizabeth said. "A pleasure." "Franklin, please. We're family now." "Franklin," she said. She watched him and Nathaniel greet each other, the particular handshake of 2 men who share blood, but not closeness, who have learned to perform familial ease well enough that only someone paying close attention would notice the temperature of it. She paid close attention. Dinner was civil. Franklin was charming in the way some men are charming when they are making a sustained effort. stories about Richmond commentary on the political situation, questions about the estate delivered as interest rather than inventory. But the questions about the estate were inventory. Elizabeth catalogued each one quietly across the table and said nothing. After dinner, Nathaniel went to the study to finish something he'd left unresolved before their parcel walk, and Franklin materialized at Elizabeth's elbow in the hallway with the smoothness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this configuration. "A word, if I may," he said. "Of course," she said. They sat in the front parlor. Franklin crossed his legs easy in his chair, the smile doing its work. "I want to be frank with you," he said. "Please," she said, because this was apparently what men said to her when they were about to be something other than frank. "I was surprised by the marriage," he said. "I think that's understandable given the circumstances. Nathaniel has never been a man who moves quickly on personal matters." "He moved when it was necessary," Elizabeth said. "Indeed, and I understand the will's requirements placed a certain pressure on the timeline." He tilted his head slightly. "I simply want you to know that I have been aware of those requirements for some time, and I have been patient in my own expectations given the complexity of the situation." Elizabeth looked at him. "What expectations are those?" she said. Franklin smiled. "Family expectations, naturally. The estate has been Whitmore land for 3 generations. I have my own interest in seeing it continue to thrive." "I share that interest," Elizabeth said pleasantly. "Completely. I'm sure you do." The smile didn't waver. "I only mention it because, and I say this with genuine goodwill, a hasty marriage contracted under financial pressure can occasionally create complications that were not anticipated at the time of contracting. I would not want anyone to be caught unaware should any such complications arise." Elizabeth set down her cup. "Franklin," she said with the same pleasantness, "I appreciate the goodwill. I want to be equally frank with you in return. By all means, I am aware that under Virginia inheritance law, a marriage contracted within 60 days of a will's deadline is subject to a 6-month contestability period if any party with material interest in the estate files a formal challenge." She watched his face carefully. "I am also aware that the legal definition of material interest in this context has been narrowed significantly by the ruling in Hadley versus Hadley in the Richmond court last year, which means the window for a successful challenge is considerably smaller than it would have been in, say, 1814. She paused. "I mention this not as a threat, but in the spirit of the frank conversation you proposed." Silence. Franklin's smile had not disappeared exactly, but it had changed in character. It was now the smile of a man who had miscalculated the nature of the person he was speaking to. "You have done your research," he said. "I do my research," she said. "On most things." He uncrossed his legs. The ease was still there, but it was working harder now. "You are not what I expected, Mrs. Whitmore." "I've been told that twice this week," she said. "I'm starting to take it as a compliment." She stood up. He stood up. They were perfectly civil to each other for the remaining 2 days of his visit, and on the morning he left, he shook her hand with the precise warmth of a man who had revised his strategy but not abandoned it. She watched the carriage go from the front step. Behind her, Nathaniel said, "What did he say to you the first evening?" She turned. He was in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the road where the carriage had been. "He reminded me that contested marriages under financial pressure are legally complicated," she said, in a very friendly way. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I'll have my lawyer." "I told him about Hadley versus Hadley," Elizabeth said. He recalibrated. Nathaniel looked at her. "When did you learn about Hadley versus Hadley?" he said. "The afternoon before I gave you my answer in the garden," she said. "I asked my father's lawyer to brief me on the relevant case law." The silence was brief. "You prepared for a legal challenge before you agreed to marry me," he said. "I prepared for every foreseeable complication before I agreed to marry you," she said. "I didn't think it was responsible to do otherwise." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said. "I imagine you didn't." The social calls began the second week. Elizabeth had expected them. Virginia County society ran on social calls, the way a mill ran on water, constantly with direction, and with considerable force when properly channeled. The wives of the neighboring landowners arrived in careful sequence, each one representing a different tier of the local social order, each one bringing a version of the same combination. Genuine curiosity, careful assessment, and the specific gift of a woman who was sizing up another woman while pretending to welcome her. She received them in the front parlor. She was unfailingly. She did not perform the role of wealthy landowner's wife with any visible effort which she understood might itself be read as either confidence or deficiency, depending on who was reading it. Mrs. Hartwell came on Tuesday. She was 55, the wife of the largest neighboring property owner, and she had the authority of a woman who had been the social arbiter of this county for 20 years and knew it. She looked at Elizabeth over her tea with eyes that were kind and absolutely merciless at the same time. "We have wondered," she said, "about Nathaniel's choice." "I imagine you have," Elizabeth said. "He is not a man who explains himself." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "You are very young." "I'm 26, Elizabeth said, "which feels neither young nor old. Mostly it feels like I'm the age I am." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes sharpened with something that might have been amusement. "Your mother was Eleanor Prescott before she married," she said. "I knew her slightly. She was very direct." "She was," Elizabeth said. "I've been told I'm like her." "Yes," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I can see that." She set down her cup. "Miss Bellamy has told several people that the marriage was a financial arrangement, a transaction, that you came here to clear your father's debts." Elizabeth met her eyes. "Miss Bellamy is not wrong that my family's financial situation was a factor in the circumstances. She is wrong about what the marriage is." "And what is it?" "It's a marriage," Elizabeth said simply, "between two people who looked at each other honestly and decided they could build something. Whether that satisfies the county's expectations about romance is a matter I'm content to leave to the county." Mrs. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. Then she did something Elizabeth had not anticipated. She laughed, a short, genuine sound entirely unlike her carefully calibrated social manner. "Your mother," she said, "would have said almost exactly that." The garden became the center of everything. Not metaphorically, or not only metaphorically. Elizabeth began working on it in the second week of the marriage, because it was the thing she could see most clearly needed doing, and because working with her hands while her mind processed the 17 other things she was navigating simultaneously was simply how she had always functioned. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce an intention. She put on her working dress one morning and went out to the section outside the east window and began the slow assessment of what was there and what it needed. Davis found her there. He stood at the edge of what she was doing with the expression she was learning to read. Not hostile exactly, but protective. This garden had been his responsibility in the sense that neglect had become its own form of stewardship. He had been leaving it alone for years because Nathaniel left it alone, and it had become through that shared leaving alone a kind of agreed-upon monument. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Davis." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "What do you know about the soil drainage on this side of the property?" He blinked. He had been prepared, she could see, for a conversation about whether she had permission to be here, which was a conversation she had no intention of having. "It runs east toward the lower meadow," he said after a moment. "Gets waterlogged in spring. That's what I thought. Is there any existing channel on the east boundary, or would we need to cut new drainage?" He looked at the ground. She watched him shift almost imperceptibly from a man prepared to defend something to a man being asked a practical question. "There was a channel," he said. "Mr. Whitmore Sr. had it put in. Got silted up around 1213. Could it be cleared? Need to dig it out. Week's work, maybe less. Would you have the labor for it in the next month, or would it need to wait until after harvest?" Davis looked at her for a moment. "Could do it after the south field's in," he said. "October, maybe." "October works," she said. "Thank you, Davis." He nodded. He stood there for another moment, and she went back to what she was doing, and she heard him walk away. She did not look up to see his expression, because she already knew what she needed to know. He had answered her question. That was enough. Nathaniel found her in the garden that evening. She heard him come out, but kept working carefully, separating what was dead from what was dormant, which was a distinction that required attention and wasn't immediately obvious from the surface. "Davis told me about the drainage channel," he said. "We'll do it in October. It shouldn't disrupt anything before then." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him crouch beside her. "My mother planted this," he said. "I know. I used to come out here when I was a boy. She'd be in here from first light in the summer." He was quiet. "When she died, I came out here every day for about 3 months. I don't know what I was doing exactly. Just coming." Elizabeth stopped what she was doing. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the garden with an expression she had not seen on him yet. Not the defended thing, not the practical man, not even the brief warmth she'd seen in careful moments. Something older than all of those. "What was she like?" Elizabeth said. "Small," he said. "Which I remember because my father was not small, and I got the impression when I was very young that the world was organized by size. She was small, and she was very loud about things she cared about and completely silent about things she didn't." He paused. "She cared about this garden. She was loud about it. She used to argue with the gardener we had then about the best placement for the lavender. Every spring the same argument." "Who won?" "She did," he said. "Every year. He just made her argue for it." Elizabeth looked at the section of this garden she'd been working in. "The lavender is in the wrong place," she said. "Whoever moved it after she died put it somewhere with too much afternoon shade. It should be on the south-facing edge." He looked at where she was pointing. "She would have been very loud about that," he said quietly. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "She would have been right." They stayed in the garden until the light went, and they didn't talk much. There was a quality to the silence that didn't need filling. And when they went inside, Elizabeth felt something that she hadn't felt in the Whitmore house yet. Not comfort exactly. Something more like the specific sensation of a place beginning to be inhabited rather than just occupied. Then the letter came. It arrived on a Thursday 3 weeks into the marriage, addressed to Nathaniel in a hand Elizabeth didn't recognize. She was at the desk in the small sitting room when Mrs. Aldridge brought the Morning Post, and she saw Nathaniel pick up the letter from Richmond and read it standing in the hallway, and she knew from the stillness that came over him that something had changed. He came to the doorway. "It's from my father's lawyer," he said. "My father's will." She put down her pen. "There was a codicil," he said, "filed in Richmond 7 years ago. I was not informed of it at the time." "What does it say?" He handed her the letter. She read it. The codicil stated in the precise language of a document designed to be unambiguous that the marriage requirement in the original will was not satisfied by a marriage contracted within 45 days of the birthday deadline. The original will had specified 60 days. The codicil filed quietly in Richmond 7 years ago had narrowed that window. 45 days. They had been married 49 days before Nathaniel's birthday. She read it again. Then she put it down. "This codicil would invalidate the marriage's effect on the inheritance," she said. "Yes." "If it's legitimate." "Yes." "Is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "That is the question my lawyer in Richmond is now determining." She looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with the expression of a man processing something that had just significantly rearranged the landscape of his life, and doing so with the same controlled attention he brought to everything which she had come to understand was not coldness, but the specific discipline of a man who had learned that panic was a luxury he could not afford. "When did your father file this?" she said. 7 years ago, a year before he died." "Why?" "I don't know. Does Franklin know about it?" He looked at her. The look lasted exactly long enough to tell her that the question had landed precisely where she'd intended. "My lawyer," he said carefully, "is also looking into that." She stood up. "All right. While he looks into it, I want to look at something else." "What?" "The original will," she said. "Not the codicil, the original. Your father filed the codicil 7 years ago, which means 7 years ago something changed. Something made him want to adjust the terms." She looked at him steadily. "Men don't change their wills for no reason. They change them because something happened. And I want to know what happened. I was looking at her with that expression again, the one she had started to think of as the moment he adjusted his understanding of something. You think someone influenced him, he said. I think it's possible, she said. I think the timing and the beneficiary of this codicil both deserve scrutiny. She picked up the letter. And I think we should find out who witnessed it. The witness was a solicitor named Marsh, practicing in Richmond, who had been engaged to a woman from the Bellamy family for 2 years before the engagement dissolved, and who had subsequently handled several of the Bellamy family's minor legal affairs. This was what Nathaniel's lawyer found when he began pulling threads. He came to Whitmore Estate on a Saturday, a compact man named Everett, who had the look of someone who had spent 30 years reading documents and had developed in consequence a specific immunity to surprise. He sat in the study and laid out what he'd found. The codicil is technically valid, he said. The form is correct. Your father's signature is genuine. I've had it compared. He paused. The witness, however, is a problem. Why? Elizabeth said. Because Marsh was at the time of witnessing engaged in business with a third party who had a material interest in the estate's inheritance structure. Everett looked at Nathaniel. Specifically a party who would benefit if the primary inheritance did not transfer on the original terms. Franklin, Nathaniel said. I cannot say that definitively, Everett said carefully. What I can say is that the chain of connection exists. Whether it constitutes legal grounds to challenge the codicil's validity depends on whether we can demonstrate that your father was influenced rather than simply persuaded. There's a difference, Elizabeth said. In law, yes, a significant one. Everett looked at her with the expression of a man who had just recalibrated his estimate of someone. A man can be persuaded that a change is prudent and make it of his own free will. If that's what happened here, the codicil stands. But if someone provided him with false information, if they misrepresented the risks of the original terms to induce a change, then it's fraud, Elizabeth said. Then it's potentially fraud, Everett said. Potentially. Nathaniel stood up and moved to the east window. He stood there with his back to the room, and Elizabeth watched him and let him have the moment because some things needed looking at before they could be spoken. My father trusted very few people, he said finally. The ones he trusted completely. If someone he trusted told him the original will created a problem, he stopped. He would have changed it, without necessarily investigating whether the problem was real. Who did he trust? Elizabeth said. Nathaniel turned from the window. He looked at her, and then at Everett, and then back at her. His solicitor, his doctor, and his cousin Albert, who died in 15. He paused. Albert's son. Everett said nothing. He didn't need to. The name sat in the room. Franklin. Elizabeth picked up her pen. She pulled a sheet of paper from the desk. She said without looking up, Everett, if you were going to find evidence that someone misrepresented the estate's inheritance risk to an aging landowner in order to induce a will change, where would you look? Everett watched her begin writing. Letters, he said. Correspondence between the parties in the period leading up to the codicil's filing. Account records showing whether any financial benefit changed hands. And the doctor. Why the doctor? Because men making significant decisions late in life are often counseled by their doctors. If someone was advising your father on his will, there's a reasonable chance the family doctor knew about it. Is the doctor still practicing? Dr. Henshaw, Nathaniel said from the window. He's in Charlottesville now, retired mostly. He was my father's doctor for 20 years. Elizabeth wrote down the name. All right, she said. She looked at Nathaniel. Then that's where we start. He looked at her across the room. He looked at the paper in front of her with his father's doctor's name on it, and at the pen in her hand, and at the expression on her face, which was not angry and not afraid, and not performing any of the things she wasn't. You're not going to ask me if I want to pursue this, he said. Do you want to pursue this? Yes. Then I'm not going to ask, she said. I'm going to help you. They went to Charlottesville together, which was not the conventional thing for a newly married couple to do with their 4th week of marriage, but was, Elizabeth reflected, consistent with pretty much everything else about how this marriage had begun. Dr. Henshaw was 70 years old and living in a small house full of medical texts and a great deal of barely organized paper. He received them in his front room and looked at Nathaniel Whitmore with the particular fondness of a man who had watched someone grow from a boy. "Nathaniel," he said, "I wondered if someone would come eventually." Nathaniel went very still. Elizabeth set her hands quietly in her lap. "You knew," Nathaniel said. "I knew your father was troubled," Henshaw said carefully. "In his last 2 years. He was troubled by something he'd been told about the estate, about the will, and he came to me about it. Not as a medical matter, as a—" He stopped. "He trusted me." "What was he told?" Nathaniel said. Henshaw looked at him for a long moment. "That under the original terms of the will, if you did not marry on time, a certain provision would allow a legal challenge to the entire estate structure. Not just the inheritance, the foundational title." He paused. "He was told there was a flaw in the original estate documentation that made the title vulnerable if the inheritance transfer didn't occur cleanly." "Is there a flaw?" Elizabeth said. "I don't know," Henshaw said. "I'm a doctor, not a lawyer. I only know what he was told." "Who told him?" Henshaw was quiet. "He never said the name directly," he said. "He was protecting someone, even from me." He looked at Nathaniel. "But he told me it was someone who loved this family, who came to him," he said out of concern. The word landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. Nathaniel turned away. He walked to the window of Henshaw's small front room and stood there, and Elizabeth watched the line of his shoulders and the set of his jaw, and she understood what was happening inside him. Not the cold, not the defense, but the specific grief of a man discovering that the thing he most trusted had been used against him. "Nathaniel," she said. He didn't turn. "Nathaniel." Her voice was steady and low. "Look at me." He turned. "Your father loved you," she said. "Whatever he was told, whatever he changed it because he was trying to protect what he built. Someone used that." She held his eyes. "That's on them, not on him, not on you." His jaw moved, the tightening she had learned to read. "I want to know who," he said. "I know," she said. "So do I." She turned back to Henshaw. "Did your father ever write to you about this, doctor, any letters?" Henshaw stood up slowly. He crossed to a cabinet in the corner of the room that was clearly where the barely organized paper most densely lived, and he pulled open the second drawer, and he withdrew a bundle of letters held together with a piece of faded ribbon. "I kept them," he said. "I didn't know why at the time. I just kept them." He handed them to Elizabeth. She untied the ribbon carefully. She looked at the first letter and then the second, and on the third page of the third letter, she found what she was looking for. Not a name, but a reference oblique and careful to a relative who has made himself indispensable, and a visit in the autumn of 1813 that had left the elder Whitmore much agitated and newly persuaded of the urgency of revision. October 1813, 4 months before the codicil was filed. She looked up at Nathaniel. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. She turned the letter and held it so he could read the passage himself. And she watched him read it, and she watched him become absolutely still in the specific way she had learned meant he had arrived somewhere he couldn't come back from. "All right," he said. His voice was quiet, not angry, the kind of quiet that lives on the other side of anger once it's finished burning. "All right," he said again. "Let's go home." They drove back from Charlottesville in the afternoon light, and for a long time they didn't speak. Elizabeth sat beside him in the carriage with the letters in her lap, and the particular weight of a day that had contained more than a day ought to contain, and she didn't try to fill the quiet. He broke it somewhere on the road past the county line. "My father built everything he had on the belief that family was the thing that lasted," he said. "He used to say that land outlives men, but only family outlives land." He was looking at the road ahead. He trusted Franklin because Franklin was the only other Whitmore left after Albert died, because his father had built with Albert the way my father had built with me. He was lied to by someone who knew exactly how to use that, Elizabeth said. "Yes. That doesn't diminish him." Nathaniel was quiet. "It diminishes something," he said. "Yes," she said, "because it would have been a lie to say it didn't." "It does. And I'm sorry for that." She looked at him. "But it doesn't change what the estate is. It doesn't change what you built. It only changes what you understand about Franklin, which is," she paused, "useful information, painful as it is." He looked at her then. Full on. The way he had looked at her in the study that first day when she'd laid the letter on his desk and refused to sit down until he made her, and he'd calculated something about her that had turned out to be correct. "How are you so steady?" he said. She thought about that. She thought about the Carter kitchen table, with the letter sitting on it for 11 days, and the 2-mile walk in the July heat, and the young man in Charlottesville, who'd gone silent, and Caroline Bellamy on her doorstep. "I've had a lot of practice holding things that were heavy," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked back at the road. "Everett thinks we can build a case," he said. "It'll take time. Months, maybe longer. It won't be comfortable." "I know." "The county will know what's happening. There will be talk." "There's already talk," Elizabeth said. "There has been since I walked into your estate in July with a worn-out dress and your father's debt letter. It'll be worse." "Nathaniel." She waited until he looked at her again. "I walked 2 miles in July heat because I decided the truth was worth doing something uncomfortable for. I haven't changed my mind about that." The carriage moved through the afternoon, and the light came through the trees in long bars, the particular gold-going amber of a Virginia summer evening. And Elizabeth sat with the letters in her lap, and the marriage that had been built in 5 days, and was now being tested 3 weeks in, and she felt against everything the solid thing at the center of it. She had not built it on hope. She had built it on honest conversation, and tomato plants, and a man who crouched in the dirt and asked good questions and kept his appointments even in the rain. That was enough to stand on. That was, she thought, considerably more than most people started with. Everett came back with his findings on a Monday morning, which was, Elizabeth had already learned, his preferred day for delivering information he had spent the weekend organizing into maximum clarity. He sat in the study with a leather folder on his knee and the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for and was not entirely pleased about it, because finding what you were looking for in a fraud case meant the fraud was real, and a real fraud meant real damage, and real damage meant real people who had made choices that could not now be unmade. The codicil, he said, was prepared by Marsh based on a document provided to him by a third party. That document purported to be a legal analysis of a flaw in the original estate title, a claim that the foundational deed of 1872 contained an error that would expose the entire title to challenge if the inheritance transfer was not executed under specific conditions. "Was there a flaw?" Nathaniel said. "No," Everett said flatly. "There was no flaw. The deed is sound, has always been sound. The document provided to Marsh was fabricated." He opened the folder. "I have a letter here from the Richmond Land Registry Office confirming that no challenge to this title has ever been filed, and that the deed has been reviewed twice in the last 15 years without any notation of defect." The room was very quiet. "Someone fabricated a legal document," Elizabeth said. "Showed it to your father, used it to frighten him into changing the terms of his will, then used those new terms to try to invalidate your marriage and take the estate." "That is what the evidence suggests," Everett said. Nathaniel sat with his hands flat on the desk. Elizabeth watched him. She had learned to read his stillness by now, the different qualities of it, the way a long silence from him could mean calculation, or anger, or grief, and how you could tell which by the set of his jaw and whether his eyes were moving. Right now, his eyes were not moving. "Franklin was at this estate 3 times in the autumn of 13, Nathaniel said. "I was in Richmond for most of October that year, settling a contract for the winter grain. He visited my father alone." He paused. "I thought nothing of it. He was family. He had always come and gone." "Did your father ever mention those visits to you?" Elizabeth asked. "He mentioned that Franklin had been helpful, that he'd brought some paperwork from Richmond that had needed addressing." His voice was even, but the evenness was doing a great deal of work. "I didn't ask what paperwork." "Nathaniel." She waited until he looked at her. "You trusted your family. There is nothing wrong with that. "There is something wrong with being used because of it," he said. "Yes," she said. "There is. But the wrong belongs to the person who did the using." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back at Everett. "What do we do?" Everett closed the folder with the precision of a man who had been waiting for that question. "We file a formal challenge to the codicil on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. We present the fabricated document, the testimony from Henshaw, the connection between Marsh and the Bellamy family, and the timeline of Franklin's visits to your father." He paused. "I also have one more thing." He reached into the folder and withdrew a single sheet. "A letter," he said. "Written by your father in December of 13, 6 weeks after the codicil was filed. Addressed to his solicitor, not Marsh, his original solicitor, a man named Croft, who had retired by then. He wrote to Croft asking whether it was possible to reverse a codicil without the knowledge of the party who had recommended it." Nathaniel looked at the letter. "He changed his mind," Elizabeth said quietly. "He had doubts," Everett said. "Whether those doubts matured into certainty before he died, I cannot say. But he had them, and he documented them." He looked at Nathaniel. "Your father in the end was not entirely certain he had done the right thing." Nathaniel picked up the letter. He read it. Elizabeth watched him read it and did not look away, because she thought that if their positions were reversed, she would want someone to stay present with her through it, rather than giving her privacy as a form of looking away. He set it down. "File the challenge," he said. The filing became public knowledge within a week because legal challenges in a county this size were never private for long. The information moved through the social fabric, the way water moves through a crack, finding every available path, widening as it went, arriving places it had no formal invitation to be. Elizabeth heard about it at the market on Saturday morning, which was how she heard about most things that the county was processing collectively in fragments in the half-conversations of women who paused beside the vegetable stalls and adjusted their bonnets and said things that were almost what they meant. Mrs. Hartwell found her by the herb cellar. "There is a great deal of talk," she said without preamble, which Elizabeth had come to appreciate as her natural mode. "I imagine so," Elizabeth said. "Some of it is sympathetic. Most of it is not yet decided." She looked at Elizabeth with those kind, merciless eyes. "How are you managing?" "I'm buying chamomile," Elizabeth said, holding up the packet. "For the garden." Mrs. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. "You're not going to tell me it's difficult." "You already know it's difficult," Elizabeth said. "You didn't come here to be told that." "No," Mrs. Hartwell said. "I came to tell you that whatever the legal process produces, the way you conduct yourself during it will matter more to this county than the outcome." She paused. "People here have long memories for how a person stands under pressure." "I know," Elizabeth said. "Stand straight," Mrs. Hartwell said. And then she moved on to the next stall with the efficiency of a woman who had said what needed saying and considered the matter addressed. Elizabeth put the chamomile in her basket and went home. Franklin arrived 3 days after the filing. He didn't send word. He simply appeared at the estate gate on a Tuesday afternoon, and Horace, who had Elizabeth noted, developed a very specific expression for Franklin Whitmore, over the past weeks came to the house to say he was there. Nathaniel looked at Elizabeth. "Do you want me to come?" she said. "Yes," he said without hesitating. They received Franklin in the front study. He came in with the smile working at full capacity, which told Elizabeth he had decided that the best available strategy at this point was charm, and she gave him some credit for understanding that it was a weak hand while also playing it as though it were strong. "Nathaniel," he said, "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding." "Sit down, Franklin," Nathaniel said. Franklin sat. He looked at Elizabeth with an expression that was almost warm. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm glad you're here, actually. I think some of this may have grown from a misinterpretation of my intentions toward you both." "Tell us your intentions," Elizabeth said. "My intentions were always to protect the estate," he said. "When my father died, I understood myself to be the last remaining Whitmore in a position to look out for Nathaniel's interests. When I became aware of the potential flaw in the original deed—" "There was no flaw," Elizabeth said. Franklin paused. The smile recalibrated slightly. There was a document suggesting, "A fabricated document," she said. "Prepared by someone who wanted your father's estate title to appear vulnerable, so that when you presented it to Nathaniel's father, he would change his will in a direction that benefited you." Silence. Franklin looked at Nathaniel. "You can't believe. You visited my father 3 times in October of 13, Nathaniel said. "Alone, while I was in Richmond." His voice was completely level. This was Elizabeth had learned more frightening than anger from him. "You told him the estate had a title problem. You provided documentation. He changed his will within 8 weeks of those visits." He paused. "Tell me what I'm supposed to believe instead." Franklin's composure was holding, but it was holding the way a fence holds when the soil around its posts is wet still upright, but with a quality of precariousness that was visible if you knew where to look. "I was trying to protect the family," he said. "You were trying to take it," Nathaniel said. "I was trying to ensure that a hasty marriage contracted under financial pressure didn't—" "Franklin." Nathaniel's voice cut clean. "My wife is sitting in this room." The word landed differently than it had before. Not the formal term, the actual claim. The thing he meant when he said it. Elizabeth felt it. Franklin looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not guilt, not quite, but the specific discomfort of a man who has been operating on an understanding of someone else's worth and has just had that understanding corrected. "Nathaniel," he said quieter. "Whatever you think I did, my father and your father built this county together. Albert Whitmore worked this land. I have some right. You have no right," Nathaniel said, "to what was built by someone else using methods that would shame both our fathers in a way that injured a family that did nothing to deserve it." He stood up. "I am going to pursue this filing. Everett will present everything we have found. The court will determine the codicil's validity." He moved to the door and held it open. "If you want to challenge that process, you are welcome to do so with your own lawyer." Franklin stood. The charm was gone entirely, now replaced by something older and more complicated. The expression of a man who had wagered a great deal on an outcome that was no longer available. He looked at Elizabeth one more time. She met his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying that the room had not already said. He left. Nathaniel closed the door. He stood with his hand on it for a moment back to the room, and Elizabeth waited. "Are you all right?" she said. "No," he said. "Then, yes, I will be." He turned around. He looked at her across the study at the desk, with Everett's folder on it, and the maps on the wall, and the cup of coffee, going cold by the inkwell, and her sitting in the chair that had started to feel like it had her shape. "Elizabeth," he said. "Yes. I owe you an accounting." "You don't owe me. When I asked you to marry me," he said, "I told you the terms. I cleared the debt. I offered you the management of the estate. I said you would not need to perform the role of wife, as the county defines it." He came away from the door and sat down across from her. "What I did not tell you was that I intended to actually be a husband, because at the time I was not certain I knew how." Elizabeth was very still. "I am still not certain," he said. "But I want you to know that I am attempting it, deliberately." He looked at his hands. "In case it has not been clear." The room was quiet. "It's been clear," she said. "Has it?" "Yes," she said. "The chamomile you asked Davis to source from the Charlottesville grower, because I mentioned I wanted it for the garden. The way you moved your evening work to the sitting room, so I didn't have to sit alone while I was reading." She paused. "The fact that you came to find me in the garden instead of sending someone." He looked at her. "Small things," he said. "Small things are how you know," she said. "Anyone can manage a grand gesture. Small things are what's actually true." Something in his face moved in the direction she had learned to watch for the brief, undefended thing that appeared, and then got carefully managed back into something more composed. But she was fast enough now to see it before it went. "You see too much," he said. "I see what's there," she said. "I'm not inventing it." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother used to say," he said slowly, "that the secret to this estate was patience, that the land would tell you what it needed if you were willing to be quiet long enough to hear it." He paused. "I was never good at quiet, not the kind she meant." "You're better at it than you think," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. "You listened to me talk about tomato steaks for 20 minutes, she said. "And you asked real questions, not polite questions, real ones." "I wanted to understand," he said. "I know," she said. "That's rather the point." The hearing was set for November. The month between the filing and the hearing was the month that made everything else real. Not the legal process, which moved forward with Everett's customary precision, but the daily texture of a marriage being built inside a dispute, which was, Elizabeth reflected, an unusual construction site. She learned that Nathaniel woke early. Not like her early, which was first light garden-driven practical, but even earlier before the household was moving, when the house had the particular quality of a place still held together by sleep. She found him once at 5 in the morning at the desk in the study, not working, but sitting with a cup of cold coffee and the letter from Henshaw's bundle spread out in front of him. She didn't say anything. She went to the kitchen, made 2 fresh cups of coffee, brought them back and sat down across from him. He looked up. She handed him the cup. He took it. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. Neither of them went back to sleep. They sat in the study in the 5 o'clock quiet and drank their coffee, and he told her about the winter. His father had been ill 15 years ago. The winter he'd run the estate alone, for the first time every decision, landing on him with the specific weight of decisions that had no one else to absorb them. How he'd learned what he was made of that winter. How he wasn't entirely sure he liked everything he'd found. "What did you find?" she said. "That I am better at the estate than at people," he said. "That I tend to treat complicated problems the same way, regardless of what kind they are, as if everything can be solved with sufficient analysis and correct action." He turned his cup. "Margaret used to say I managed grief the way I managed a bad harvest. Assessed the damage, made a plan, moved forward." "Is that wrong?" Elizabeth said. "She thought it was incomplete," he said. "She thought there were parts of the process I was skipping." "Were there?" He was quiet for a moment. "Probably. Yes." He looked at her. "Are there things you think I'm skipping now?" She considered the question honestly because he deserved honesty and she had promised it. "You analyze what Franklin did very clearly," she said. "The mechanism, the timeline, the legal consequences. You're less present with what it means that someone you considered family did it." He was quiet. "I know what it means," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm not sure you felt it yet." He looked at his coffee. "No," he said after a long moment. "Probably not." "That's all right," she said. "It doesn't have to happen on a schedule." He looked at her. "You are remarkably patient with things that don't happen on a schedule." "I grow things for a living," she said. "You develop opinions about timelines." Her father came to dinner the 3rd week of October. This was not the first time William Carter had been to the estate twice since the marriage, each time with a formality that was gradually becoming something more relaxed, not comfortable exactly, but moving in that direction. He and Nathaniel had developed a relationship. Elizabeth found quietly wonderful. 2 men who had been honest with each other under difficult circumstances and had a kind of respect for each other that was more real than whatever would have grown in easier conditions. At dinner, her father looked better than he had in 2 years. Not young the year had marked him, but more like himself. He'd gone back to the accounts at his old firm on a consulting basis, which gave him something to be expert in again, which was, Elizabeth understood, more medicine than anything Nathaniel's debt forgiveness had provided. After dinner, while Nathaniel was talking with Davis about the October drainage work, her father found her in the sitting room. "You look well," he said. "I feel well," she said, which was true in the complicated way that true things often are, not simple, not without cost, but genuine underneath. "He's a good man," her father said. He said it the way he said things he had thought about for a while before, saying carefully with the weight of someone who did not distribute that assessment lightly. "Difficult in the way certain people are difficult, but good." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "He looks at you," her father said. "The way your mother used to look at things, she was trying to understand. Like you're worth the effort of figuring out." Elizabeth looked at her hands. "Papa," she said. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to say it." She looked up at him. He was smiling, the real one, the one that looked like the face she'd grown up with before the year of the letter. "Thank you," she said, "for letting me go that morning." He shook his head slightly. "I didn't let you go. You went." "I know," she said, "but you didn't stop me." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother would have done the same thing," he said. "Exactly the same thing. Same walk, same dress, same letter." "The same walk," she said softly. "Your mother's walk," he said, "was the most honest thing she owned, and you inherited it clean." Caroline Bellamy came to the estate on a Thursday, 2 weeks before the hearing, and this time she came to the front door and sent in her card properly, which Elizabeth recognized as a change. She received her in the front parlor. Caroline looked at her across the room with an expression that was different from the one she'd carried at the Carter house. The calculation was still there, would always be there. It was part of her structure, but something else was present too. Something that looked like it had cost her something to carry this far. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "All right," Elizabeth said. "I knew about the codicil." The room went very still. "Not about the fraud," Caroline said quickly. "I didn't know it was fabricated. I knew the codicil existed. Franklin told me about it 2 years ago. He told me it meant Nathaniel would need to marry within a narrower window than the county understood, and that if he didn't find a suitable match in time." She stopped. "You thought you'd be the one he turned to," Elizabeth said. Caroline's hands, folded in her lap, tightened very slightly. "I had known him for 20 years, she said. "I thought I believed that when the pressure became real, I would be the logical choice." "And then I walked into his study," Elizabeth said. "And then you walked into his study," Caroline said quietly. Elizabeth looked at her. "Did you know Franklin had fabricated the document?" "No." She said it cleanly, without defense. "I want you to believe that. I knew he was maneuvering. I didn't know how far he'd gone. When Everett's filing became public, She stopped again. "I recognized that I had been part of a situation without fully understanding the situation. And I thought you deserved to know that." "Why?" Caroline looked at her steadily. "Because you told me the truth at your house that day, when you had no obligation to. And I have been thinking about that since." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to testify?" she said. "If Everett asks me," Caroline said. "Yes." "He'll ask," Elizabeth said. "What you just told me about when Franklin informed you of the codicil's existence establishes the timeline. That matters." Caroline nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." They sat in the front parlor for another half-hour, and something happened in that room that was not quite friendship, and was not the formality of adversaries, and was something that existed mostly between women who have looked at the same situation from different angles and come to understand that neither angle is the whole picture. When Caroline left, Elizabeth stood at the window and watched the carriage go and thought about 20 years of knowing someone. About what it cost to set down the thing you'd been carrying for 20 years and walk into the house of the woman who was carrying it now and tell the truth anyway. It cost something real. She knew that. And she didn't take it lightly. Nathaniel found her still at the window when he came in. "Who was that?" he said. "Caroline," she said. He went very still. "She's going to testify," Elizabeth said, "about when Franklin told her about the codicil. It establishes the timeline." He stood beside her at the window and looked out at where the carriage had been. "She came here," he said. "She did. To help you." "To tell the truth," Elizabeth said. "Which helped us both." He was quiet. Then, "Elizabeth." "Yes, I need to tell you something I have not told you yet." She turned to look at him. His face had the quality it had at 5 in the morning over cold coffee, open, without the usual management. "Available. After Margaret died," he said, "I decided that the estate was enough. That building something lasting was sufficient purpose. I believed it for 9 years. He looked at the window at whatever was out there. "When I made you the proposal in the garden." When you said yes, I told myself the terms were the reason. The practicality of it. The sensible alignment of two people's needs. He paused. I was not entirely honest with myself about why I rode in the rain on the fourth day. She waited. Or why I moved my evening work to the sitting room, he said. Or why I thought about the north parcel every time you mentioned drainage and felt something that was not purely agricultural satisfaction. He turned to look at her directly. I am not a man who says things before he is certain of them. I am certain of this. He looked at her with the full, undefended version of his attention. Nothing managed, nothing calculated, nothing held back. I love you, he said. That is unexpected, and inconveniently timed given everything. And I don't know what to do with it except tell you because you have told me nothing but the truth since the first morning, and you are owed the same. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about the south parcel and the drainage channel, and the lavender that was in the wrong place, and the letter from Henshaw, and the codicil, and Caroline Bellamy, and her father's face at dinner, and the 5 o'clock coffee, and the way he crouched in the dirt and asked real questions. She thought about the walk. 2 miles in July heat with her mother's satchel. She thought about what she'd been carrying, and what she'd set down, and what she'd picked up in its place. I know, she said. I've known for a while. Have you? Yes, she said. The chamomile. Something broke open in his face, the complete version of the thing she'd been watching approach for weeks. Brief flashes of warmth, becoming something that didn't need to be brief anymore. The chamomile, he said. Small things, she said. Remember. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her hands. Which was the first time he had held her hands, and she looked down at them, and then up at him, and she thought that of all the distances she had walked this year, the 2 miles in July, the long, careful walk of 5 days of honest conversation, the longer walk of building something real inside a house that had been cold for years. This was the one that had ended somewhere she had not known she was going toward until she arrived. What happens after the hearing? She said. We build something, he said. Whatever comes out of it. The north parcel needs a full season before it'll produce, she said. And the drainage channel won't be done until spring. I know. And Davis is going to need convincing about the planting interval before next year's season. Elizabeth. Yes. I know, he said. We'll do it together. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. We will. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does in Virginia, going gold and serious. The particular beauty of a season that knows it's running out of time and has decided to make the most of what remains. The garden his mother had planted was past its last color for the year gone to seed and brown stem, and the patient architecture of things that would come back in spring. The lavender was still in the wrong place. The drainage channel was still blocked. There was, Elizabeth thought, an enormous amount of work still to do. She found she was not afraid of any of it. The hearing was set for the 3rd Monday of November, which gave Virginia exactly enough time to turn cold and serious in the way it did before winter. Not the dramatic cold of the northern states, but a steady settling chill that got into everything and reminded you that the warm season was over, and what remained was what was real. Everett spent the 2 weeks before the hearing, the way Elizabeth imagined he spent most of his professional life, methodically without visible anxiety. Assembling the case with the precision of a man who believed that sufficient preparation was the closest thing to certainty that the law permitted. He came to the estate 4 times. He sat in the study with Nathaniel and Elizabeth both, because Elizabeth had made clear from the first session that she intended to be present, and Nathaniel had made clear that he agreed, and he walked them through everything he had built, the fabricated document, the connection between Marsh and the Bellamy family finances, which Everett had traced through 3 intermediary accounts, with the persistence of a man who did not stop pulling a thread simply because it was inconvenient. The letters from Henshaw's bundle. The December letter from Nathaniel's father to the retired solicitor Croft, asking whether a codicil could be reversed without the knowledge of the party who recommended it. And Caroline Bellamy's testimony, which she had given to Everett in a formal written statement, precise and unadorned, establishing the exact date Franklin had told her about the codicil's existence and what he had told her it would mean. Franklin's position, Everett said at their last meeting before the hearing, is that he acted in good faith on information he believed to be legitimate. He will argue that he was deceived himself, that whoever fabricated the document also deceived him. Can he make that argument hold? Elizabeth said. He can make it, Everett said carefully. Whether it holds depends on the judge's assessment of the chain of evidence. The document came to Marsh through a channel that we can trace to Franklin's own correspondence network. It did not come from nowhere, but Franklin is free to claim he was a conduit rather than a source. He paused. It is a weak argument, but it is an argument. Who fabricated it? Nathaniel said. He asked it the way he asked things he'd been thinking about for a long time, quietly, without drama, as though the question had simply been waiting until the room was ready for it. Everett looked at him. We believe we know. There is a land surveyor in Richmond, a man named Corbell, who has done work in the past for parties who had reason to want the Whitmore estate's title to appear vulnerable. We have a record of a payment from Franklin's accounts to a firm Corbell is associated with 6 months before the codicil was filed. He paused. Corbell cannot be compelled to testify for our purpose, but the payment record speaks well enough on its own. Nathaniel was quiet. My father trusted him, he said. He sat in that study and showed my father a document my father believed was real, and my father changed his will because of it and spent the next year writing letters to his old solicitor, wondering if he'd made a mistake. He paused. And then he died without knowing. Yes, Everett said. The room held that for a moment. Then we make sure the court knows, Elizabeth said, and we make sure the record shows what actually happened so that it cannot be used again. Everett looked at her. He had the expression he sometimes got, the one that told her he had revised his estimate of her upward again, which she found quietly satisfying every time. That is precisely what we will do, he said. The morning of the hearing. Elizabeth was in the garden before first light. Not the mother's garden, the kitchen garden, her original ground. The tomatoes long since put to bed for winter, but the beds still there. The framework of what she'd built, still visible under the November quiet. She stood there in the cold and breathed, and let herself feel what she felt, which was fear. Not the running kind, but the still kind. The fear that lives in the body when something important is about to happen, and there is nothing left to do but let it happen. She heard Nathaniel's step behind her. He came to stand beside her. He was already dressed, coat hat, the careful order of a man who prepared for important days by controlling the things he could control. You should be inside, he said. It's cold. I know, she said. I'll come in a minute. He stood with her. He didn't try to move her, didn't argue, didn't suggest that the garden could wait. He simply stood beside her in the November dark and let her have the minute. Are you afraid? She said. Yes, he said, without qualification, without walking it back. She had noticed over the past weeks that he had stopped walking things back. Me too, she said. What are you afraid of? He said. She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honesty, and she had never given him anything else. That the court finds for Franklin, and we spend the next year fighting it, she said. That the county takes that as confirmation of everything they thought about who I am and why I married you. That your father's name gets dragged through something he didn't choose. She paused. And I'm afraid of none of that mattering as much as I think it will. He looked at her. What do you mean? I'm afraid that I've built something real, and that the realness of it is not dependent on what the court says today, and that I'm still going to be afraid while knowing that. She turned to look at him. Which is the particular kind of fear that is entirely useless and also completely unavoidable. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. That is exactly the kind. She looked at him. This man who had arrived at her father's study 8 months ago in her memory as a name on a letter, and had become, with the slow accumulating weight of 100 small true things, the specific person she wanted to be standing next to in the cold before a hearing that would determine the shape of their life. Let's go, she said. The courthouse in Charlottesville was not a grand building, but it had the weight of a place where things that mattered had been decided for a long time, and Elizabeth felt that weight as they walked in. Nathaniel on her left, Everett on her right, her father 3 steps behind, because he had insisted on coming and she had not tried to stop him. Franklin was already there. He came in with a lawyer. Elizabeth didn't know a man from Richmond. Expensive coat, the confident bearing of someone who had argued cases in larger rooms than this. Franklin himself looked at Nathaniel when they entered, and Nathaniel looked back, and neither of them said anything, and the quality of that silence was different from every other silence Elizabeth had witnessed between them. This one had edges. She sat beside Nathaniel at the table. She folded her hands in her lap. She had worn the blue dress, the second best one, the one with all its buttons, the one she'd worn to walk 2 miles in July. She had not done this deliberately. She had reached for it this morning without thinking, and then stood looking at it and decided it was right. Some things deserve to begin and end in the same garment. The judge was a man named Aldcroft, 60, with the look of someone who had spent enough years listening to people lie that he had developed an extremely precise instrument for detecting it. He reviewed the filings. He asked Everett several questions that were short and pointed, and told Elizabeth he had read the documents carefully before arriving. Then he called the first witness. Henshaw came in from the back of the room, moving with the careful deliberateness of a 70-year-old man in a cold building, and sat in the witness chair and told the court exactly what he had told Elizabeth and Nathaniel in his small house full of medical texts. What Nathaniel's father had said to him, when he had said it, what he had been told and by whom to the degree that he could say. Franklin's lawyer cross-examined him. He was skilled. He tried several angles: the reliability of an old man's memory, the informal nature of the conversations, the fact that Henshaw had not come forward when the codicil was filed. Henshaw answered each question with the calm specificity of a man who had spent 50 years making precise observations and was not going to stop now. "He told you he was troubled," the lawyer said. "But troubled men make their own decisions." "Yes," Henshaw said. "And troubled men who have been given false information to make them troubled are not making free decisions. They are making frightened ones." He paused. "I know the difference. I was his doctor for 20 years. The room was quiet. Then Everett presented the payment records. The chain from Franklin's accounts to the firm associated with Corbell. The timeline. The letters. And last, the December letter from the elder, Whitmore to Croft, in his own hand, asking whether a codicil could be reversed without the knowledge of the party who had recommended it. Franklin's lawyer objected to the letter on grounds of hearsay. Aldcroft overruled it with the brisk efficiency of a man who had already considered the objection and found it insufficient before it was made. Then Everett called Caroline Bellamy. She walked to the witness chair the way she walked everywhere, with the posture of a woman who had been taught since childhood that bearing was the visible evidence of worth. She sat down. She looked at Everett. She did not look at Franklin. Everett asked her 3 questions. When had Franklin informed her of the codicil's existence? What had he told her it would mean? What had she understood his purpose to be in telling her? She answered all 3 in the same precise, unadorned voice she had used for her written statement. She said that Franklin had told her about the codicil in the autumn of 1815, 2 years before the circumstances in question arose. She said he had told her that if Nathaniel did not marry within the narrowed window, the estate's inheritance structure would be complicated in ways that would create an opening for a formal challenge. She said she had understood from the conversation that Franklin considered this opening to be one he intended to use. "And did you at that time know the document establishing the supposed title flaw was fabricated?" Everett said. "No," Caroline said. "I did not." "When did you become aware of the allegation of fabrication?" "When the filing became public," she said. "And what did you do then?" Caroline paused for the first time. "I came to see Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "to tell her what I knew." Elizabeth, sitting at the table, felt Nathaniel's hand move beside hers, not taking her hand, just moving the specific motion of a man registering something. Franklin's lawyer cross-examined Caroline for 12 minutes, and it was clear within the first 2 that it was not going well for him. Caroline was not a woman who crumbled under examination. She was a woman who had spent 30 years surviving a social system that required you to say 3 things at once and mean none of them, and she had consequently become very good at saying one thing clearly and standing behind it. When it was done, she left the witness chair without looking at Franklin and sat in the gallery 3 rows behind Elizabeth. and Elizabeth did not turn around, but she felt the specific quality of another person's courage in the room, and she recognized it. Franklin's lawyer made his argument. It was as Everett had predicted, the good faith conduit argument, that Franklin had received information he believed to be legitimate and had passed it to his uncle out of genuine concern, that he had not known the document was fabricated, that the codicil, whatever its origins, expressed terms that his uncle had agreed to of his own free will. It was a competent argument. Elizabeth listened to it carefully and gave it the credit it was owed, which was, it was not nothing. A different judge with a less complete set of evidence might have found it sufficient. Aldcroft did not find it sufficient. He was quiet for a moment after both sides had finished. Long enough that the room took on that particular courthouse texture of people trying to breathe normally while their futures were being considered. Then he spoke. The evidence presented establishes to this court's satisfaction that the codicil filed in January of 1814 was the product of a chain of events initiated by the provision of fabricated information to the testator with the intent of inducing a change to the will's terms that would benefit a party with a material interest in the estate. He looked at the papers before him. The codicil is accordingly set aside as invalid on grounds of fraudulent inducement. The original will stands. The marriage of Nathaniel Whitmore and Elizabeth Carter. Whitmore, contracted within the original 60-day window, satisfies the will's requirements in full. He looked up. This court also finds sufficient grounds for a referral to the Richmond Attorney General's office regarding the fabrication of the title document. That matter will proceed separately. He looked at Franklin directly. I would advise all parties to govern themselves accordingly. He set down the papers. He stood. The room stood. Elizabeth sat still for 1 full second after everyone else was moving because she needed 1 second to hold it, the whole of it, the morning in the garden, and the walk in July, and the 5 days of conversation, and the cold coffee at 5 in the morning, and the hands held at the east window, and the October light on everything. 1 second to hold it before it became the past. Then Nathaniel's hand found hers under the table. She held it. The walk out of the courthouse was not triumphant. Elizabeth had not expected it to be, and she was glad she hadn't, because what it actually was more complicated and more real than triumph. It was Nathaniel shaking Everett's hand with the specific grip of a man who means the thing the handshake says. It was her father beside her with his good coat and his eyes too bright, not saying anything, because the moment didn't need words. It was the cold November air outside, and the particular quality of a sky that was neither cloudy nor clear, but somewhere between the way most things actually are. Franklin left through the side door. She saw him go. He didn't look back, and she didn't call after him, and she thought that was probably as it should be. Not everything required a final word. Caroline came out the main door a few steps behind them. She stopped when she saw Elizabeth. They looked at each other across the steps of the Charlottesville courthouse. Elizabeth said, "Thank you." Caroline looked at her for a moment. The calculation was still there, would always be there, but something else had grown alongside it over the past weeks. Something that looked like it had been earned rather than assumed. "Don't waste it," Caroline said. The same words, the same low voice, but different in her mouth this time, because this time she wasn't warning. She was releasing. Elizabeth held her eyes. "I won't." Caroline nodded once. She walked to her carriage. Elizabeth watched her go. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They were home by afternoon. Mrs. Aldridge had the fire going and had apparently communicated with someone in Charlottesville through means Elizabeth hadn't fully mapped yet, because there was food ready and the sitting room arranged with the specific thoughtfulness of a woman who understood that returning from something significant required a house that met you properly. Davis came to the door an hour after they arrived. He stood in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, and the expression that was Elizabeth had learned his version of full emotional investment, contained but present. "Heard it went well," he said. "It went well," Nathaniel said. Davis nodded. He looked at Elizabeth. "That drainage channel," he said. "I've got the men available next week if the weather holds." "Next week works," Elizabeth said. He nodded again. He put his hat back on. He left. Nathaniel looked at her. "He came to tell you the drainage channel is on schedule," he said. "He came to say well done," Elizabeth said. "In the way Davis says things." Which is practically, she agreed. Her father stayed for dinner. They sat at the table, the three of them, the table that had started the year as Nathaniel's table alone, the table where Franklin had eaten with his smile working at full capacity, the table that was now, through the accumulated weight of months, something else. A family table. Small, but real. Her father told a story about the firm he'd been consulting for a complicated land survey dispute that he found genuinely interesting, that had him gesturing with his fork in the way he did when he was fully engaged with something, and Nathaniel asked questions about it. Real questions, the kind he asked about the tomato stakes and the planting interval. And her father, who had spent a year being the person things happened to, was himself again, the man who knew things and enjoyed knowing them, and had someone at the table who wanted to hear it. Elizabeth sat between them and said almost nothing, and felt with the quiet completeness of something that had been a long time arriving full. After dinner, her father went home in the borrowed wagon, the neighbor's wagon, the neighbor who had turned out not to be calculating the fence line after all, and she and Nathaniel sat in the sitting room with the fire and the November dark outside the windows. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked up from the book he'd opened, but not really been reading. "When I walked out of your study the first day," she said, "and I was halfway home, and my hands were shaking. I stopped on the road. I just stood there." She looked at the fire. "I wasn't afraid. I want to say that right. I wasn't afraid. I'd been holding something very tightly for a very long time, and I'd just been told I could hold it a little less tightly for 60 more days, and the release of that was..." She paused. "I didn't know then what it would turn into. I didn't know you. I just knew that someone had listened to me and told me the truth, and that was enough to make my hands shake." I was watching her. "I want you to know that that's still what I value most," she said. "Not the estate, not the legal outcome today. That you listen, that you tell me the truth." She met his eyes. "That is the thing I will not take for granted." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been told," he said, "by more than one person, in more than one way, that I am not easy to be married to." "Yes," she said. "I know. And you are not..." He paused. "You are not easy to be married to either, Elizabeth. You see everything. You say what you see. You are right at a frequency that would be insufferable if you were ever wrong about anything important." She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It is the most accurate description of why I love you that I have managed to produce so far." Something moved through her chest. Warm, complete, the feeling of a thing that was true. Being said and landing where it was meant to. "I'll take it," she said. 3 days after the hearing, she moved the lavender. She'd been thinking about it since August when she first identified the placement problem, and she'd been waiting for the right time for the ground to be in the right condition for some internal sense of when. She woke on that Thursday and knew it was the day. She dug it up carefully, all of it maintaining as much root structure as she could. She worked through the morning in the cold, methodical, with the specific satisfaction of doing something that was both practically right and symbolically right, which was, she had found the best kind of thing. Nathaniel came out at mid-morning with coffee. He handed her a cup and crouched beside her the way he had crouched over the tomato vine in July, looking at what she was doing. "South-facing edge," he said. "South-facing edge," she confirmed. "My mother's argument," he said. "Your mother was right," she said. "She was just fighting the wrong person about it." He handed her the next section to plant, and she pressed it into the prepared soil and firmed it with both hands, and thought about a woman she'd never met who had built this garden and argued about lavender placement and raised a son who crouched in dirt and listened to real questions and kept his appointments in the rain. "She would have liked you," Nathaniel said. Elizabeth smoothed the soil around the plant. "I think I would have liked her too," she said. They worked through the morning together, which was not something she had planned, and which she suspected he hadn't planned either, but which happened because he was there, and she was there, and the work was there, and some things simply don't need more reason than that. Winter came properly, the second week of December. With it came a letter from the Richmond Attorney General's office confirming that the referral from Judge Aldcroft was being pursued and that Franklin Whitmore had been requested to present himself for formal examination. Everett sent a note with the letter that said simply, "The process will take time. The outcome is likely to be proportional to the evidence. I will keep you informed." Elizabeth read the letter at breakfast and passed it to Nathaniel and watched him read it. "How do you feel?" she said. He thought about it, which was something she had noticed he did more often. Now actually considered the question rather than producing an immediate answer that was less true. "I feel that my father deserved better than what was done to him," he said. "And I feel that whatever happens to Franklin, it won't change what was done. It might mean something to the record. It might mean something to the families who work this land to know the estate they've built their lives around is on solid ground." He set the letter down. "But I stopped needing a particular outcome from it 2 months ago." "When?" she said. He looked at her. "When you told me that the wrong belonged to the person who did the using. Not to my father. Not to me." She looked at her coffee. "I didn't know that would matter that much," she said. "That's because you said it as a fact," he said. "Not as comfort. You weren't trying to make me feel better. You were telling me what you thought was true." He paused. "That's the difference." She looked up at him. "Small things," he said. "Small things," she agreed. The drainage channel was finished in January. Davis told her on a Tuesday with the same practical economy he used for everything, and she walked the east boundary to look at the work, and he walked with her explaining the slope calculations and the outlet placement with the focused satisfaction of a man who had done something he was expert in and done it well. "It'll need monitoring through spring thaw," he said. "I'll monitor it," she said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. She looked at him. "You were right about the planting interval on the east field," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that, but it was said cleanly without being extracted. "The test section outperformed the standard by about a third. I'll be putting the adjustment in for the full field next season." She had known this. She'd seen the yield records. She hadn't said anything because she had understood from the beginning that Davis's arrival at his own conclusion was worth more than her being right about it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded. He looked out at the channel he'd built. "This is good ground," he said. "Been good ground a long time. Just needed someone to pay attention to the right things." She thought he was talking about the drainage. She thought he might also not be talking about the drainage. "Yes," she said. It did. In February, a letter arrived from Uncle Thomas. He wrote with elaborate apology that took 3 pages and could have taken 1, that his business dealings had resolved finally fully in his favor, that he had accordingly the funds he had promised, that he understood the circumstances had changed significantly since his assistance was required, but that he was prepared to send the sum regardless as a matter of family honor. Elizabeth read the letter at the kitchen table. She read it twice. Then she sat with it for a moment. She wrote back the same day. She told him the debt had been cleared as part of the marriage settlement, and the funds were no longer needed for that purpose. She told him their father was well and working again, and that the Charlottesville correspondence scandal had resolved satisfactorily. She told him that if he wished to mark the occasion of what he called family honor, he was welcome to visit in the spring when the garden would be worth seeing. She signed it, "Your niece, Elizabeth Carter Whitmore." The name sat on the page and looked like itself. She folded the letter. She went to find Nathaniel. He was in the study naturally with the ledgers and the maps and the cold coffee. He looked up when she came in. "Thomas wrote," she said. "The money's there. He wants to send it." "What did you tell him?" "That it wasn't needed, that we were well, that he should visit in spring." She sat down in her chair. "I thought you should know." He looked at her for a moment. "The debt that started all of this." "Yes." "And it doesn't exist anymore." "It doesn't exist anymore," she said. He was quiet. "Does that feel like anything?" he said. "For you." She thought about it honestly. "It feels like the beginning of something that became something else entirely," she said. "Like a seed. You plant it for what you think it is, and what grows is different, and the difference is the part that matters. She looked at him. I walked 2 miles in July to clear a debt. I ended up here. She paused. I'm not going to complain about the route. He looked at her with the full version of his attention, nothing managed, nothing held back. Neither am I, he said. The garden came back in April, not all at once, never all at once. That was not how gardens worked, but piece by piece, the way things come back that have been waiting rather than gone. The lavender, first in the new placement, throwing up green shoots from the south-facing edge where the light hit it right. Then the chamomile spreading with the particular generosity of a plant that believes in abundance. Then the old medicinal herbs from Elizabeth's mother's section, reliable as they had always been, requiring nothing from her but the preservation she had always given them. And the roses. The roses had been there all along. She'd found the canes in October underneath everything else, dormant and thorned and patient as old things are patient. She'd cut them back to sound wood and let them be. And in April, they came back. Not with the tentative single bloom of a plant, testing new conditions, but with the full extravagance of something that had been waiting for exactly the right combination of soil and care and someone paying attention. Nathaniel came out to find her standing in front of them the morning they opened. He stood beside her and looked at them and said nothing for a moment. My mother planted those, he said finally. I know, she said. She was right about the roses, too. He was quiet. She planted them the spring before she died, he said. She never saw them bloom. Elizabeth looked at the roses. She thought about a woman she'd never met, small and loud about the things she cared about, arguing every spring about lavender placement, building something in the ground that she would not live to see. She saw them, Elizabeth said. She just saw them in the planting. Nathaniel turned to look at her. She met his eyes. You see a bloom, and you think it's the beginning, she said. But the beginning was months ago in the ground before anything was visible. She knew what she was putting down. She knew what would come. She looked back at the roses. She saw it. She just didn't need to be here for the proof. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something she had not seen him do before. He reached down and took one of the open blooms in his hand, gently, not picking it, but holding it for a moment. The way a person holds something they are glad is still there. He let it go. He looked at Elizabeth. She would have been loud about you, he said. Very loud. Elizabeth smiled. The real one. The one that had been happening more often in this house, in this garden, in the specific conditions of a life being built with someone who paid attention. Good, she said. I would have argued back. Yes, he said. You would have. He took her hand. They stood in the April garden with the roses and the properly placed lavender and the chamomile spreading its abundance and the drainage channel doing its work along the east boundary and the north parcel resting through its necessary season and the estate surrounding them, all 500 acres of it. The good ground that had been good ground a long time and just needed someone to pay attention to the right things. And Elizabeth Carter Whitmore, who had walked 2 miles in July heat with her mother's satchel and her father's debt, and her chin up, and her mother's walk, stood in the garden she had brought back from the dead, and held the hand of the man she had not known she was walking toward, and understood that what she had built was not what she had set out to build, and that was the whole point, and that was enough, and that it was in fact considerably more than enough. Some people lose everything, the money, the name, the careful life they planned, and discover that what they built on the way to getting it back is worth more than what they lost. Some debts, when you follow them all the way to the end, turn out not to be debts at all. They turn out to be the beginning of the only thing that actually lasts.